Hey there. Yes, you're right on the other side of that screen. Come on in, get yourself settled. Maybe pull that blanket up just a little higher and let your shoulders drop for a moment, because tonight we're going somewhere quiet together, somewhere most people never think twice about. I am so glad you found your way here. Wherever you happen to be watching from, whatever hour it happens to be where you are right now. Tonight we're stepping inside the most glittering court in all of England, gold thread velvet cloaks, a king who believed the whole world answered to him. But behind every one of those perfect white collars, behind every spotless linen shirt that made him look untouchable, there stood one woman alone in the dark, keeping a secret so strange, so oddly personal, that once you hear what filled her wooden buckets each night, you may never look at a clean white shirt quite the same way again. Before we slip past those palace doors together, let me ask you for something small. If stories like this one are the kind that help your mind finally go quiet at the end of a long day, it would mean more than, if you tapped that subscribe button, left this video a like, or even dropped a comment somewhere below, only if you are truly enjoying being here with me. Nothing forced at all. I love hearing where in the world you're tucked in tonight and what time it happens to be for you. It always makes this feel a little less like a video and a little more like two people sitting quietly in the same room. Alright, dim the lights just a bit more if you can let a soft fan hum somewhere in the background, and let's slip into tonight's story together. Somewhere deep in the 1500s, long after the last candle had been carried out of the council chamber, and long after the last lord had shuffled off still muttering about matters only kings and their closest men were allowed to argue over, one woman was only just beginning her work. Moonlight slid quietly across an empty banquet table where only a few hours earlier roasted meats and spiced wine had vanished into the mouths of men who had never once stopped to wonder, who kept their linen napkins so perfectly white. Heavy tapestries stirred slightly in the draught along the corridor, and somewhere far above, a chapel bell marked an hour almost nobody at court was awake to hear. Her name was Anne Harris, and if you had passed her in the corridor that night you likely would not have looked twice. No jewels, no fine gown, just a plain woolen apron, a pair of hands already rough beyond her years, and a small tallow candle throwing shadows twice her size along the cold stone walls of Henry VIII's palace. Anne was the royal laundress, and in a court built almost entirely on appearances where one dull, grey collar could quietly ruin a man's reputation before he ever opened his mouth. Her work mattered more than almost anyone at court cared to admit. She was paid £10 a year for it, which, for a woman in Tudor England, was a remarkably good wage. But there was a catch tucked quietly into her contract, and it tells you almost everything about how differently this world worked. Anne was required to supply her own soap. Think about that for a moment. A king who owned half of England, who could summon armies with a single word, still expected the woman who kept his linen spotless to walk into the job already carrying the one thing that made it all possible. So that night, like most nights, Anne made her own. Her workroom sat in the coldest part of the palace. Tucked below the kitchen's walls slick with damp, the low ceiling hung thick with drying herbs, rosemary, hawthorn. Small bundles of lavender that swayed gently whenever a draught slipped through. Wooden barrels lined one wall, packed with ash saved carefully from every fire in the palace for weeks at a time. When she held her hands near the single candle, they told their own quiet story read across the knuckles cracked along the thumb, the kind of hands nobody at a royal banquet would ever think to notice, let alone thank. And here is where the story turns a little unexpected, because the secret behind a truly white collar in Tudor England had almost nothing to do with soap, not at first. It started somewhere far less glamorous. Part of Anne's evening work was walking the halls near the council chamber, quietly collecting the contents of the chamber pots left behind by some of the most powerful men in England, lords, advisers. Perhaps on certain nights men who had just finished deciding the fate of entire nations, completely unaware that the very thing they left behind in a simple pot would soon be soaking their own finest shirts. If only they had known somewhere in the middle of some tense argument about war or taxes that the real power in that palace at that hour belonged to the quiet woman following behind them with a bucket. They called it Chamber Lie a Soft, almost polite little name for something far more direct. Left to stand for several days in a covered container, it would, through some quiet chemistry nobody at court fully understood, yet turn into one of the strongest, most dependable stain removers and whiteners available anywhere in the 16th century. And strangely enough, after standing long enough, the smell faded almost completely. Anne would have known this the way any woman who had spent years bent over a washtub simply knows things no book had gotten around to explaining yet, mixed carefully with lye made from wood ash, filtered again and again through cloth until the liquid ran clear. This became the base for something called black soap, a thick jelly-like substance boiled slowly with animal fat until it turned dark and heavy inside the barrels where it was kept. It was not pretty. It did not smell of roses. But it worked, and in Tudor England that was the only thing that truly mattered. The tub she used for all of this had a name of its own, a buck tub tall and wooden, with a small hole near the base where the used lye could be drained off and saved for the very next wash. Some historians believe this humble household object is where we get the phrase passing the buck, a chore quietly handed down from one wash to the next long before the words ever meant handing off blame. True origin or charming laundry folklore, either way, the buck tub was for its time about as close as Tudor England ever came to owning a washing machine. There was, of course, a far more fashionable option whispered about at court. Word had travelled from Spain of a soap so fine, so gentle, a person could use it directly on their own skin, something almost unheard of at the time. It arrived in England thanks to Catherine of Aragon, tucked among her belongings when she crossed the sea to marry a young Henry VIII. They called it Castile soap, and for a little while it became the talk of the court, a beautiful, expensive novelty that never quite managed to replace the reliable, unglamorous black soap doing the real work behind the scenes, which, if you think about it, is a very human thing. We have always been a little more charmed by the shiny new invention than the boring old one that actually gets the job done. By the time Anne had finished sorting the linens into her waiting tub, cleanest pieces resting on top, the dirtiest ones tucked below, the palace around her had gone almost completely silent. Just the occasional creak of old wood settling somewhere overhead, the far-off bark of a hound past the gardens, and her own breath, visible for a moment in the cold night air. She poured the lye slowly over the linen and let it soak, knowing the tub would need to sit undisturbed through the night before the real scrubbing even began. In the morning, she would haul water in heavy copper pots and set them to boil, add extra ash for the stubborn stains, and scrub each piece by hand across a rough wooden board for hours, arms aching, steam curling up around her face, sleeves pushed high before a single item was fit to be rinsed, wrung out and finally spread to dry, ideally over a sweet-smelling bush of rosemary or hawthorn so the linen came back smelling faintly of a garden instead of a washroom. This was never a quick little chore squeezed in before breakfast. Wash day in Tudor England could stretch across 2, sometimes 3 full days, and it happened again and again, week after week, year after year, for as long as Anne held her position. And yet, somehow this quiet, back-breaking, deeply unglamorous work sat at the very centre of how the world judged a person's worth. People in Tudor England did not bathe often, not the way we think of bathing today, but clean linen that was everything. A crisp white shirt, a spotless collar was treated almost like a public statement proof that a person, or an entire household, was disciplined, respectable, worth trusting. Dirty linen, on the other hand, could quietly follow a person's name the way a rumour does, whispered about long after the actual stain had faded. Of course, all of this belonged to a very particular kind of household. Most people living outside those palace walls owned perhaps 1 or 2 shirts in an entire lifetime, worn for weeks at a stretch, washed only a handful of times a year, if that. Only the wealthy could afford the luxury of appearing again and again, in linen this clean. Which makes Anne's nightly ritual something even stranger to picture an entire exhausting little industry, built quietly around keeping just a small handful of powerful people looking flawless. Which means, in a strange roundabout way, the king's whole reputation for elegance rested quietly on the shoulders of a woman almost nobody at court ever thought twice about. Every single time Henry VIII walked into a room looking every bit the powerful, immaculate ruler history still remembers him as, somewhere behind that image stood Anne Harris, hands raw, sleeves damp awake long before anyone else at court and asleep long after. By the time the first grey light touched the high windows and the rest of the palace slowly began to stir, fires being lit, kitchens waking the king himself still fast asleep in a chamber, far warmer and finer than anywhere Anne would ever rest. She had already been working for hours. Women like her almost never appear in the grand portraits or the history books written about this era. If they show up at all, it is in a single line of some household ledger, a name, a wage, a small note about soap, and yet without them none of the glittering images we still associate with the Tudor court could have existed at all. Historians have filled entire libraries writing about the kings, the wars, the wives, the scandals, but somebody somewhere had to keep that famous white collar looking exactly the way it does in every single portrait, and it seems nobody ever thought to paint her. Here is the part I find almost impossible to stop thinking about. What Anne Harris was quietly doing under candlelight that night was never just one woman's job. Inside one single palace in one single century. It was the very first thread in something enormous. The exact same basic problem she was solving with wood ash and a covered bucket would still exist 500 years later, just dressed up completely differently. The tools would change again and again. The people doing the work would change again and again. Who it fell on, who it quietly freed, who it just as quietly trapped. All of that would shift decade after decade, country after country, but the chore itself, the simple, endless task of getting clothes clean, would never fully disappear. It would only ever change shape. Somewhere in your own home tonight, there is probably a laundry basket sitting quietly in some corner waiting. It might not look like much, but stay with me, because I promise you after tonight you will never look at it quite the same way again. So let's follow it. Let's step past these cold palace walls together and watch exactly how this one small, unglamorous task travelled forward through time, decade by decade becoming something almost unrecognisable, and yet somehow underneath it all still telling the very same human story. Step far enough past those palace gates beyond the last drowsy watchman leaning on his spear, and the whole picture changes completely. Because for every laundress quietly working behind a king, there were thousands of ordinary families scattered across the English countryside who could never have dreamed of keeping one on staff. No stone laundry room, no candle burning through the night just for them. For most people living outside those palace walls washing clothes was not a weekly ritual at all. It happened once, maybe twice a year, and when it did, it consumed an entire household, sometimes an entire village for days at a time. They called it the Great Wash. It usually came in late spring or early summer once the weather could finally be trusted, though trusted is a generous word for it. Every household kept one eye fixed nervously on the sky. Choose the wrong week, and a sudden downpour could soak half-dried linen straight through undoing days of back-breaking work in a matter of minutes, forcing a family to hang wet, half-clean sheets by the fire for weeks, or simply live with linen that never came fully white again until the following year. There was no trying again next Tuesday. Miss your window and you often waited a full 12 months for another chance. For days beforehand, a kind of quiet anticipation settled over a village, fires being built up early, extra water hauled and stored, children warned more than once to stay well out from underfoot. This was not something a single household simply decided to do on a whim. It took planning, borrowed tubs, borrowed hands, and more than a little hope that it would not rain. In a farmhouse kitchen not so different from thousands of others scattered across England, that same season a grandmother might have spent the morning showing her youngest granddaughter exactly how much wood ash a tub of that size needed, guiding small hands through motions those same small hands would repeat for the rest of their lives. The air would have smelled faintly of smoke and damp wool ash dust catching in the light from the open door. Get the mixture wrong too weak, and the linen stayed dull too strong, and it could eat straight through delicate fabric, so the lesson mattered, and it was given with the kind of patience only comes from having made the same mistake once, long ago yourself. Nobody wrote these lessons in books. There was no need to. The knowledge simply moved from one set of hands to the next generation, folding quietly into generation, the way a family recipe survives without anyone ever bothering to measure it precisely. Picture it for a second. No detergent aisle to run to, no spare drawer full of backup shirts. Most families owned only a handful of linen garments in total worn, and slept in and worked in for weeks on end before they ever touched water. So when wash day finally arrived, it was never a quiet private chore tucked away behind closed doors. It was an event, almost a small festival if you squint hard enough through the smoke and the steam. Try imagining it for a moment. If your entire wardrobe only got washed once a year, how many shirts do you think you would actually need to survive until the next one rolled around? For days beforehand, a household would gather everything that needed cleaning sheets, shirts, undergarments, tablecloths, and let it all soak in tubs of the same wood ash lye we already met back at court, except now mixed in far larger batches often shared between several families who could not each afford their own barrel of ash. For the greasier stains the kind plain lye could never quite reach. Some households turned to a soft chalky clay called fuller's earth, worked into the fabric by hand until the stains slowly lifted away a trick borrowed from the very same wool workers who cleaned raw fleece for a living. Once the soaking was finished, the real labour began. Women, and it was almost always women, hauled the sodden linen down to the nearest river or stream, knelt on cold stones or wooden planks, and beat the cloth again and again with long wooden paddles, the locals called beetles or bats or dollies, depending on which part of the country you happened to be standing in. The sound alone must have carried for miles a steady rhythmic thud of wood against wet cloth water, slapping against stone voices rising and falling underneath it all. Working a stubborn stain loose with a dolly stick inside a narrow wooden tub was such tight, awkward work that people began describing any difficult, cramped situation in life as being caught between the beetle and the block, a phrase that quietly outlived the very chore that created it. It was loud, physical, unglamorous work, and yet strangely enough it does not seem to have been entirely miserable. Unlike Anne alone in her cold stone chamber back at court with nobody but a candle for company, most of the women scrubbing away here were never truly alone. Accounts from the period describe riverside wash days filled with singing, teasing and gossip, passed from one kneeling woman to the next, news of a wedding, a scandal, a harvest gone wrong, travelling down a single stretch of river faster than any letter could have carried it. In a world with no newspapers reaching most villages and certainly no telephone to simply call a friend, wash day may well have doubled as the one guaranteed gathering where women controlled the conversation entirely away from husbands, away from priests, away from lords. There is something almost rebellious hiding inside all that soap and cold water if you think about it. Worth pausing on too is who exactly was kneeling at that river in the first place. Men built the tubs, men chopped the wood, men occasionally hauled the heaviest water, but the actual washing, the scrubbing, the endless kneeling on cold stone fell almost entirely to women and girls. This was never written into law anywhere. Nobody voted on it. It simply hardened year after year into something that looked like tradition, then eventually into something that looked like fact, the kind no one thought to question out loud for a very long time. And this was not only a chore for the poor. Records from the household of England's most celebrated playwright, a man whose plays were filling London theatres at the very same time, show that even his own family's linen was only washed this way once a year, same as everyone else's. Fame and fortune, it turns out, bought better food, finer clothes, a grander house, but it did not buy your way out of the Great Wash. Some things apparently applied to everybody equally. Once the beating and scrubbing was finally finished, the wet linen was carried to open grassy fields on the edge of town known as bleaching greens, and spread out flat under the sun for days, sometimes sprinkled again with water to help the sunlight do its slow, quiet work of whitening the cloth. From a distance, an entire field covered edge to edge in pale, rippling linen must have looked almost like snow that had fallen in the middle of summer. Entire towns set aside land specifically for this purpose, an early unglamorous cousin of the public park. Winter, of course, offered no mercy and no excuse. If a garment absolutely had to be washed, women still walked down to that same river, even once ice had crept across its surface, breaking through it, if they had to plunging bare hands into water cold enough to ache within seconds. Skin cracked, knuckles swelled red and tender, a condition they simply called chilblains, one that could linger painful and itching for weeks after the water itself had long since dried. Do this winter after winter, year after year, and it leaves a mark that never fully goes away, joints that ache before their time hands that never quite look young again. And yet in one small, almost forgiving twist, frost itself turned out to whiten cloth nearly as well as summer sunlight. One strange, quiet mercy folded inside an otherwise miserable season. Nobody wrote poetry about any of it. Nobody painted it either, not really. It was simply the price of clean linen paid quietly year after year, by hands most of history never bothered to look at closely. Here is something I think we tend to get completely backwards when we picture this era. We imagine people back then as careless about cleanliness, almost proudly filthy, happy to remain surrounded by dirt, because they simply did not know any better. But the Great Wash tells a very different story. This was not carelessness. It was an enormous, coordinated, physically brutal undertaking, precisely because clean linen mattered so deeply that entire communities were willing to organize their whole year around achieving it even just once. And this was rarely about vanity either, or keeping up appearances the way it may have been back at court. For most families, clean linen simply meant dignity, a quiet, private kind of pride that had nothing to do with anyone watching. A poor farmer with almost nothing to his name could still walk into church on a feast day in a shirt that had been beaten clean by his own wife and daughters, and for one single day at least he could stand there looking every bit as respectable as his landlord. That more than anything might be the real reason this exhausting ritual survived century after century unquestioned. It gave people, even people who owned almost nothing else, one small thing they could still control. And once you start pulling on this thread, the story only grows stranger, because that same wood ash and urine mixture keeping village linens white was not just a household trick tucked away in one country in one century. Head further north into the wool-producing regions of England, and you find something almost impossible to believe. Merchants there were paying good money for barrels of urine shipped in on carts from towns and villages across the country, an amount historians estimate could equal roughly what 1,000 people might produce over an entire year mixed with a mineral called alum to create a powerful dye fixer that helped wool hold its colour. Somewhere along a dusty road, a farmer's humble chamber pot and a merchant's fine dyed cloth had quietly become part of the very same supply chain. What started as a household trick had, without anyone quite planning it, become an actual traded commodity, bought, sold and shipped like any other raw material England had to offer. Doesn't that change how you think about a bad smell, knowing someone somewhere once built real money out of it? And if that surprises you, brace yourself, because this idea is nowhere close to new. Rewind the clock back further still, more than 1,000 years before Anne Harris ever lit a single candle in that palace corridor, and you land in ancient Rome, where an emperor named Vespasian looked at his empire's finances, decided he needed more money, and found it in the last place anyone would think to check. Public restrooms across the city collected urine in large jars, later sold off to tanners, dye makers and launderers who prized it for exactly the same cleansing properties Anne would come to rely on centuries later. Vespasian taxed the sale of it. His own son found the whole scheme beneath the dignity of an emperor and said so loudly more than once. So Vespasian, without a word, simply held a single coin up to his son's nose and asked whether it smelled of anything at all. It did not, of course. And that the story goes was answer enough. Money, whatever its origin, never quite carries the scent of where it came from. People have been finding value in the things we would rather not think about for a very, very long time. And in certain corners of the world, this exact scene, women kneeling at a riverbank, beating cloth clean by hand, trading news and laughter in the same breath, has never actually stopped happening. It is still happening somewhere tonight in places running water and washing machines have not yet reached. 500 years of progress, and some things simply have not needed to change at all. So by the time the sun set on another finished great wash linen glowing faintly white across some quiet English field, an entire chain of ordinary hands, riverside women with aching backs, northern merchants trading barrels of ashen urine, distant echoes of a Roman emperor's treasury had already been quietly connected for centuries long, before anyone thought to write any of it down as history worth remembering. There's a version of this story we like to tell ourselves, that progress moves in one straight, tidy line, primitive and dirty at the start, clean and modern by the end. But laundry never really worked that way. It moved sideways as often as forward, borrowed from empires long fallen, carried forward by women whose names nobody bothered to record, changing shape completely, depending on where you happened to stand in the social order, yet somehow never truly disappearing. And here is where the story's about to take its biggest turn yet. Because those very same bleaching greens, those same wooden beetles and dolly tubs, those same wood ash recipes, passed quietly from mother to daughter, were about to cross an ocean entirely. Ships loaded with hopeful families, seed grain farm tools, and a lifetime of half-remembered household habits would soon carry every one of these small, exhausting rituals to a brand new world, a world with wider rivers, harsher winters, and far higher stakes than any village green back in England had ever demanded. Some who made that crossing would choose this life drawn by land, by opportunity, by a fresh start. Others would have absolutely no choice in the matter at all, carried across that same ocean, against their will, their own names and stories deliberately left out of the history books for centuries afterward. And once they landed, the work would not simply continue, it would deepen, and for some of the hands doing it, it would turn into something far heavier, far crueler than anyone back in that quiet English village could ever have imagined. Somewhere along the slow wide bend of the Potomac River on the border between Virginia and Maryland stood Mount Vernon, the plantation home of George Washington. Gone were the cool grey skies and damp village greens of the last stretch of this story. Here summer arrived, heavy and thick air pressing down over tobacco fields and wide brown water, the kind of humidity that made even standing still feel like work. Visitors walk through the grand white mansion by the thousands every single year, admiring the columns, the view of the water, the polished furniture arranged exactly the way it once was. Almost none of them linger very long over the small plain brick building tucked just out of sight behind it. Low walls, a single chimney, no columns, no river view, nothing built to impress anyone at all. They called it the wash house, and for a small group of women who spent nearly every waking hour inside it, this modest little building held one of the heaviest, most exhausting jobs on the entire estate. Their names, where they survive at all, come down to us in scattered fragments, a line in a farm ledger, a mention in somebody else's letter, a note tucked inside an old household account. Dulcie, Vina. Women who, according to the estate's own surviving records, worked in that wash house up to 6 days out of every 7 washing and drying clothing and linens, not only for the Washington family, but for long-term guests, hired staff and the overseers who ran the farms beyond it. The work began well before the household itself had stirred fires lit in near darkness, water hauled and set to heat, while the grand house up the hill still slept soundly behind closed curtains, and it rarely finished before the sun had gone down again. General Washington's hospitality was by most accounts widely admired across the colony. Guests staying more than a week could count on clean linen the entire time they visited. Behind that quiet, gracious reputation, 6 days a week, stood women who had absolutely no choice in providing it. Sit with that difference for a moment, because I think it matters more than almost anything else in this whole story. Back in England, the women we just spent the last stretch of this journey with were exhausted too, chilblained, aching, bent, double over cold rivers. But they did this work once, maybe twice a year on their own terms, surrounded by their own community singing, while they did it free whatever else their lives lacked to eventually walk home. Here, an ocean away on a very different kind of soil, that same basic chore had been stretched out, compressed and forced into something else entirely. Not a seasonal ritual anymore, a permanent, unpaid, unrelenting job assigned to people who were under the law of the land they had been forced to call home, considered property rather than people. The process itself stretched across roughly 3 full days from start to finish. An entire household's linens, sorted, marked, soaked, boiled, scrubbed, rinsed, and finally dried all entirely by hand. Because so many different people, family members, guests, hired staff, all contributed garments to a single laundry cycle. Each item first had to be carefully marked initials stitched or inked quietly into a collar or a hem, simply so it could find its way back to its correct owner once clean. A small, almost bureaucratic detail, and yet it tells you something important. This was never a casual chore squeezed into a spare afternoon. It ran like an organized, almost industrial operation on a fixed schedule, week after week, for as long as the household required it. There was one telling difference tucked quietly into the household's own records worth noticing. Unmarried white servants working at the estate had laundry service written directly into their employment agreements, a benefit spelled out and guaranteed. Married white workers simply had their own wives handle it at home. For the enslaved women running the wash house itself, there was no agreement to honour no wage attached. No version of the arrangement that ever considered their own comfort at all. It is worth pausing here to notice something else too. Back in that cold Tudor palace at the very start of this story, Anne Harris kept a king looking flawless, worked brutal hours, and received almost no recognition for it either, but Anne was paid. Anne had at least on paper a position she could theoretically walk away from, a wage of her own, a life that belonged, imperfect as it was to herself. Strip every one of those thin, fragile protections away, and you arrive here at this wash house where the exact same invisible labour kept an entire household's reputation intact. Yet the women performing it owned nothing of their own time at all, not even under the law themselves. Once the linens were finally dry, the real skill of the job began. A single laundress often had to manage 3 flat irons at once, one heating in the fire, while a second was already pressed against fabric, and a third stood cooling nearby, timing every swap perfectly, so nothing ever scorched, and the whole rhythm of the work never once slowed down. Steam curling up around tired hands, the smell of hot cloth and wood smoke thick in a small closed room, even in the middle of a Virginia summer, sweat gathering along a hairline that never had a moment to properly cool. This took years to learn properly, the kind of quiet, exacting judgment that comes only from doing something wrong enough times to finally understand exactly how to do it right. It was in every sense that matters a real and considerable craft, performed daily by women who was by law owned as property, their expertise valued by the very household that refused to value them. Here is the detail I find hardest to simply move past. The very same hands pressing crisp, spotless linen for a dinner party, folding fine tablecloths, ironing delicate shirts until they looked flawless, often belonged to women who, according to the estate's own surviving clothing records, were issued only a single set of coarse plain clothing. Each year, a rough fabric called Osnaburg, unbleached, scratchy, nothing like the fine linen passing through their own hands all day long. No spares waiting in a drawer somewhere, which meant that on the very days their own single outfit needed washing, there was often simply nothing else to put on in its place. Sit with that pairing for a second, spending your entire day perfecting somebody else's wardrobe, while owning in total barely enough cloth to properly cover your own back. Can you imagine spending your whole life making something beautiful for people who would never once think to ask your name? None of this happened in isolation either. By 1799, the estate's own records counted more than 300 enslaved men, women, children living and working across its farms, an entire hidden community, holding up the daily comfort of a household. Most history books remember for very different reasons entirely. Laundresses, housemaids, cooks, blacksmiths, seamstresses, people with skills, relationships, private thoughts, private griefs, almost none of which anyone with the power to record it ever bothered to write down. Within that community, people still found small, quiet ways to build something like ordinary life. They cooked together when they could, looked after each other's children, passed news and comfort back and forth, the same way any tight-knit community does, simply with far higher stakes attached to every single word spoken. Historians who study Mount Vernon closely will tell you this. Plainly, the enslaved community there was never merely a workforce. It was a web of families, friendships, and quiet loyalties existing entirely on its own terms, tucked just underneath the surface of a household that rarely acknowledged it as such, and still somehow inside a washhouse built for someone else's convenience, something recognizably human kept finding its way through. The same scattered fragments of record that give us Dulcie and Vina's names in the first place also tell us that people in that household formed real close attachments to each other, and that at least a few of them, when the smallest opportunity appeared, risked absolutely everything to claim a life that belonged to nobody but themselves. One young woman who served in that very house slipped quietly away during a dinner party one evening, while the family sat distracted by guests and conversation, crossing into a northern state, and remarkably was never recaptured, spending the rest of her long life as a free woman under a name of her own choosing. Another man, a personal attendant to the family for over 20 years, attempted almost exactly the same thing, and was caught before he ever reached safety, brought back to a life he had already proven, once and for all, he did not want. Neither story happened inside the washhouse itself yet. Both tell you something no ledger ever could, that even surrounded by soap ash and endless mountains of somebody else's laundry. The longing for a different life never once stopped quietly burning underneath it all. It rarely does, no matter how completely a system tries to convince someone otherwise. There is an uncomfortable irony sitting at the centre of all this, one worth naming plainly, rather than tiptoeing carefully around it. This was, after all, the household of a man remembered by history as one of the founding voices of liberty on this entire continent, a man whose own private writings later in his life wrestled openly with the question of slavery, even as his own estate kept running day after day on exactly this kind of forced, unpaid labour. Just a few years before, Dulcie and Vina would have been working in that very wash-house. This same young nation had declared on paper, at least, that liberty belonged to everyone. I wonder how those words might have sounded carried faintly through an open window to a woman scrubbing another family's linen 6 days out of 7, with no say whatsoever in her own life. In his final will, Washington ordered that those he personally held in bondage be freed after his wife's passing, making him, by most historical accounts, the only figure among that particular generation of founders to do so outright. It is worth being honest about the limits of that gesture too. It applied to little more than half the people actually living and working at Mount Vernon, since many belonged under the property law of the time to a separate family estate entirely, and it came only after death, not while it could have meant anything to the women who had already spent entire lifetimes bent over washtubs receiving nothing for it beyond survival itself. And Mount Vernon, for all the attention historians and visitors alike have given it, was never the exception. Up and down the eastern seaboard, behind grand houses whose names still appear on postcards and history plaques today, nearly identical washhouses stood staffed the exact same way, running on the exact same unpaid forced labour. What happened here happened in one form or another on farm after farm, estate after estate, for as long as slavery itself remained legal on this soil. Dulcie and Vina were never an isolated story. They were simply two of the very few names that happened to survive. I want to be honest with you here because I think this particular part of the story deserves that much. There is no tidy, comforting lesson to wrap this chapter in. No clever twist that makes it easier to carry. Just the plain documented truth that some of the cleanest, most beautifully kept linens in early America passed through the hands of women who owned almost nothing themselves, not their labour, not their time, not even under the law, their own children. And yet here is where I think this story quietly connects back to everything we've already walked through together tonight. Whether it happened by candlelight inside a cold stone palace at a riverbank surrounded by laughter, or inside a small brick building behind a house that history chose to remember for entirely different reasons, the actual physical task itself never really changed at all. Soak, scrub, boil, wring, dry, iron, fold. The same handful of motions repeated endlessly century after century, continent after continent, no matter who was forced to perform them, and no matter how differently or how unfairly the world chose to reward the people doing it, which raises a question worth sitting with for just a moment before we keep moving. If this exact same back-breaking motion had been repeating itself almost unchanged for hundreds of years now, across palaces, villages, and plantations alike, how much longer could it possibly continue before somebody somewhere finally became obsessed with building a machine to do it instead? Because that obsession was already stirring not very far away at all, and not very long after this. Somewhere across the ocean, in workshops full of gears, springs and half-finished sketches, a very different kind of person was about to bend over this exact same problem, not with a washboard or a bucket of ash, but with a notebook, a set of tools, and a stubborn, restless conviction that there had to be a better way. Inventors scattered across a rapidly changing world We're about to look at this exact same ancient, exhausting chore and see something in it nobody quite had before. Not tradition, not duty, not even injustice, at least not to most of them. A problem plain and simple, one they had suddenly become determined to solve whatever it took and whoever got there first. There is a very particular kind of person who looks at a chore 300 years old one that has broken the backs of every generation before them and thinks quietly, but with total confidence, I can fix that. England, somewhere in the final years of the 1600s, was suddenly full of exactly this kind of person. Something had shifted in the air. Steam was beginning to hiss through factory floors that had once relied entirely on hands and horses. Textile mills along the rivers of northern England could now spin and weave cloth faster than any village weaver working alone ever could have dreamed of. And the whole country seemed to be catching a kind of fever for it, a genuine restless belief that absolutely nothing needed to stay the way it had always been. Workshops were multiplying in every industrial town, filled with gears, springs, half-built engines, and men who had grown thoroughly convinced that if a machine could weave cloth faster than 100 hands, or pump water out of a flooded mine shaft, then surely someone could finally build a machine to solve laundry too. Nobody had managed it yet. That, if anything, only made the challenge more irresistible. The very first attempt on record arrived in 1691 when an inventor named John Tezak walked away with an official patent, one of the earliest of its kind anywhere in the country. Here is the part that always makes me smile a little. His machine was not really a washing machine at all, not the way we would picture one today. It was closer to an all-purpose industrial thumper, a single heavy contraption built to pound minerals apart, soften leather crush seeds, refine pulp for paper, and almost as an afterthought tucked in among all that heavier work, agitate water hard enough to knock the dirt out of a pile of clothing too. Laundry, quite literally, was just one more thing. This machine happened to be able to beat the daylights out of files somewhere on the list, right between crushing rock and tenderizing leather. It would be another 6 decades before anyone even bothered sketching something built purely with washing in mind, as if the very idea of a machine designed for nothing but clean shirts still felt to most inventors of the era like a slightly frivolous use of good engineering. That sketch finally showed up in a popular magazine in London in the year 1752, a simple drawing of a proposed washing device, printed for curious readers to study over their morning coffee. Around the very same time, wooden washtubs fitted with a clever internal rod, a wooden disc studded with short pegs on one end, and a hand crank on the other started selling briskly across the city. Twist the handle, and the pegged disc churned the water and clothing together below, doing roughly the same job as a woman's aching arm, just slightly faster and without the aching arm. It was not glamorous. It did not look like progress the way we imagine progress today. But for the first time in this entire 500-year story, a genuine mechanism sold in a shop built by strangers was starting to stand in for human muscle. 15 years later, in 1767, a rather unusual man over in Germany published his own design for a washing machine, and I have to tell you a little about him, because he might be my favourite character in this whole chapter of the story. His name was Jacob Christian Scheffer, and depending on which day of the week you caught him, he was a pastor, a university professor, an author, and somewhat famously among his peers, an absolutely obsessive expert on mushrooms, credited with identifying and cataloguing an enormous number of fungi species that had never been properly recorded before. He wrote entire illustrated volumes on fungus. He also apparently, in whatever spare time a pastor obsessed with mushrooms manages to scrape together, found time to design and publish detailed plans for a working washing machine complete with diagrams precise enough that other inventors could study and build from them. Somewhere between sermons and studying toadstools in damp forests, this one restless man managed to leave his mark on two completely unrelated corners of history. If that does not tell you something wonderful about human curiosity, I am not sure what will. Around the same period, in 1774, an inventor named Hugh Oxenham secured a patent for something that would end up mattering more in the long run than almost any washing machine that came before it, the mangle. Two heavy wooden rollers cranked by hand, squeezing sodden fabric between them under real considerable pressure until the water ran out in a steady stream instead of a slow, exhausting drip. Think back for a moment to every wringing hand we have already met on this journey tonight. Knuckles raw from twisting wet linen by force alone. A mangle did not remove that labour entirely. Someone still had to feed the fabric through and turn the crank, but it changed the shape of it completely, trading brute grip strength for a steady rhythmic turning motion any pair of arms could sustain far longer without breaking down. For close to 150 years afterward, some version of that simple rolling mechanism sat in laundry rooms across the English-speaking world, quietly doing the one job every single method we've talked about so far still lacked getting the water back out again quickly. Can I ask you something? Try picturing the exact moment two different inventors working in two different corners of England, both filed patents for a rotating drum washing machine in the very same year, 1782, apparently with no idea the other one existed. One version, built by Henry Sigier, used a wooden drum lined with the rod's water sloshing straight through, as a hand crank spun it around and around. The other, built by James King, ran on something closer to a small water wheel harnessing moving water itself to do part of the agitating work, hot water and soap doing the rest. Neither man, as far as any surviving record shows, ever seemed to learn the other existed, both convinced at the exact same moment that they alone had finally cracked a puzzle that had resisted every previous attempt for nearly a century. Great minds apparently really do wander toward remarkably similar conclusions, completely independently of one another, laundry included. It happens more often across the history of invention than most people realize several minds circling the exact same solution at once, simply because the surrounding world had finally grown ready for it. By the 1790s, a London businessman named Edward Beetham had turned this whole idea into an actual commercial product, selling what he proudly called patent washing mills to households who could afford one, an early sign that this strange obsession with mechanizing laundry was no longer just a hobby for tinkerers. It had quietly become a business. Worth pointing out too, none of this arrived cheaply. A patent washing mill or a properly built mangle cost real money, well beyond what most working families could ever hope to spare. For decades after these machines first appeared in shop windows, the overwhelming majority of households across England and its colonies kept right on doing exactly what we described earlier in this story, hauling water, scrubbing by hand, kneeling at rivers simply because that was still for most people the only option available. Machines did not replace the old ways overnight. They sat quietly alongside them for generations, a luxury for the fortunate few, long before they ever became a household expectation for everyone else. Not everyone was convinced these contraptions were worth the money in the first place, though, and honestly, who could blame them? Plenty of households looked at these strange wooden contraptions with real suspicion, worried a machine might rip delicate fabric to shreds, or simply refused to get anything properly clean at all. The same instinctive distrust of new technology that shows up in pretty much every generation, ours included if we are being fair about it. Advertisements from the period spent almost as much effort convincing skeptical customers The machines actually worked as they did, explaining how to use them. Some things, it seems, never really change. And then in 1797, the story crosses the ocean for the very first time. A man named Nathaniel Briggs, working out of New Hampshire, received the first United States patent ever issued, specifically for a clothes washing machine. Here is where the story takes an odd, slightly haunting turn. We know his name, we know the year, we know the patent existed, officially recorded and approved by the government of a country not even 2 decades old at that point. What we do not know, and will almost certainly never know, is what his machine actually looked like, how it worked, what small clever detail made it his and nobody else's. In 1836, a fire tore through the United States Patent Office in Washington, destroying an enormous portion of the country's earliest patent records, drawings, descriptions, models, and all Briggs's invention among the casualties. An entire idea once real enough to be judged worthy of official protection by the government itself, reduced to nothing more than a name and a date. The actual machine itself, whatever it looked like, whatever small stroke of ingenuity made Briggs proud enough to file for it in the first place, simply gone erased in an afternoon of smoke none of us will ever get to see through. Doesn't that feel strange to sit with for a second? An idea good enough to be the very first of its kind in an entire country, and today we cannot even picture what it looked like. The pace only picked up from there. Through the 1840s, inventors kept experimenting with new shapes. For the same basic idea, wooden boxes rocked back and forth on a lever, agitating water and cloth, together without any drum at all, an entire small industry of competing designs, each claiming to be gentler on delicate fabric, faster than the last model, easier on a tired arm by the end of a long afternoon. Patent offices on both sides of the Atlantic filled steadily with variations on the same basic promise, dozens of clever little improvements that mostly amounted to rearranging the same handful of ideas, a rod here, a paddle there, a slightly different angle of crank. By 1858, an inventor named Hamilton Smith had patented a drum machine capable of spinning in reverse, back and forth, rather than only in one direction, a real clever improvement that helped work soap more evenly through a tangled pile of fabric. Ringers kept improving too, a 2-roller version patented around 1861, eventually becoming the standard shape you would still recognize sitting beside an old washtub in a museum today, the same basic silhouette that would go on to survive almost unchanged for the better part of another century. By 1862, this entire strange, decades-long obsession had grown respectable enough to be shown off at the London International Exhibition, a massive public fair where new machinery from around the world went on display for crowds of ordinary people to walk past and marvel at. Among the steam engines, the printing presses, and the early photographic equipment stood a compound rotary washing machine complete with built-in rollers for wringing and mangling, presented proudly to the public as a genuine marvel of the age. Try picturing that scene for a moment: well-dressed Victorian families in their Sunday best parasols and top hats, strolling slowly past a washing machine, the exact same way we might wander past a concept car at a modern exhibition. Today equal parts curious and mildly amused that something so ordinary, so tied to sweat and drudgery back home, had somehow been elevated into something worth exhibiting, at all polished, labelled, and roped off behind a little velvet cord. Here is what I find quietly fascinating about this entire stretch of the story: nearly 2 centuries of patents, tinkering, competing designs, and genuine cleverness, and not one single machine in any of it ran on anything but human effort. No motors, no electricity. Every single drum, Every crank, every wringer still needed a person standing there, turning it, hauling the water, building the fire to heat it in the first place. The machines got smarter. The physical exhaustion barely moved an inch. And there is a second, quieter twist tucked inside all of this progress too, one worth sitting with for a moment before we move forward. The very same industrial machinery revolutionizing washing was at the very same time spinning cotton and weaving cloth faster and cheaper than any point in human history up to that moment. For the first time, ordinary families who once owned only a handful of shirts between them, exactly the world we walk through a little earlier in this story, could suddenly afford several. More shirts, more undergarments, more linens sitting folded in a drawer waiting their turn, which meant that even as machines quietly promised to make washing easier, the sheer amount of clothing waiting to be washed was growing faster than any wringer or drum could keep pace with. Progress, it turns out, has a funny habit of creating exactly as much new work as it claims to save. Hold on to that thought. It is going to matter a great deal later in this story, in ways I do not think you will see coming. For now, though, all of this tinkering, all of this patent racing, all of this quiet Victorian pride in mechanical progress was about to collide head first with something far more stubborn than any engineering problem. A single day of the week, dreaded, organized, and utterly inescapable, was quietly forming itself into a ritual so deeply woven into ordinary households that an entire generation would come to measure their whole week by it, whether they actually wanted to or not. Housewives would soon give it its own nickname, and once you hear it and hear exactly why they called it that, I promise you, it will stay with you. They called it Blue Monday. Not because anyone felt particularly cheerful about it, though. That part is true too. The name actually carries two meanings folded together, and once you know both, I think you will find it hard to hear the phrase again without smiling just a little. The first meaning is chemical, almost scientific. The second is simply how an entire generation of women felt every single week without fail. Let's start with the chemistry, because it is more clever than you might expect. By the 1800s, most households finished their wash with a final rinse tinted ever so slightly blue, using a small cube or bag of dye called bluing, wrapped carefully in cloth, and dipped into the rinse water just long enough to release the faintest trace of colour. It sounds backwards at first, adding colour to make something look cleaner, until you understand the trick behind it. White fabric washed over and over tends to yellow slightly with age and repeated exposure to soap and hard water, a slow, almost invisible drift that most people would never notice happening day to day. Blue and yellow sitting right across from each other cancel each other out to the human eye. A whisper of blue in the rinse water was enough to trick anyone glancing at a shirt on the line into seeing it as bright, crisp white, rather than the faint, dull yellow it was quietly drifting toward. It was, in its own small way, a real piece of applied science. Generations before anyone had a proper word for optical brightening, worked out by ordinary women through nothing more than careful, repeated observation. And the second meaning, the emotional one, needs no explaining at all if you were a Victorian housewife. Monday simply hurt. It hurt your back, your hands, your whole week, and everybody in the house, according to the writing left behind from the period, seemed to feel it settle over the household the moment Sunday dinner had barely been cleared away. Here is something worth pausing on before we go any further, because the shift itself is enormous, and I do not think it gets nearly enough credit in how we usually picture this era. We just spent an entire stretch of this story inside a world where washing clothes happened once, maybe twice a year. By the Victorian period, that same basic chore had been compressed down into something households were now expected to perform every single week, without exception, rain or shine, sickness or health. Cheaper cloth, more clothing per household, rising standards of visible cleanliness. All the forces we touched on a little earlier had quietly rewritten the entire calendar of an ordinary woman's life. What had once been an occasional communal, almost seasonal event, shared labour and gossip and sunlight on a village green, had narrowed down into something solitary, relentless, and permanently fixed to a single day nobody was ever allowed to simply skip. For households that observed a strict day of rest on Sunday, the ritual actually began the evening before stained garments left soaking overnight in tubs of lukewarm water, so that by the time Monday morning finally arrived, the real labour could begin without delay. Picture the kitchen before dawn, a single lamp lit against the dark, the woman of the house already awake and moving quietly, so as not to wake the rest of the family, coaxing a fire under a wash boiler nearly as tall as her own waist. By the time the household finally stirred and came down for breakfast, she might already have been working for the better part of an hour, and the real labour was considerable. Water first hauled from a pump or a well if the house lacked one of its own, then heated slowly in that heavy wash boiler set directly on the stove, because nothing about this process moved quickly. Clothes were rubbed, scrubbed and scoured by hand in a tub, often against a ridged washboard, before being wrung out. Boiled for a stretch of 15 to 20 minutes in fresh soapy water to properly loosen ground in dirt, a wooden paddle used to keep everything pressed beneath the surface, and then rinsed not once but twice. That second rinse mattered enormously, and household advice books of the period were oddly specific and stern about it. Fail to wring a garment thoroughly enough between rinses, one widely circulated household guide warned quite plainly, and the fabric would come out yellowed or worse, still faintly soapy, an embarrassing little failure that any visiting neighbour might notice on the clothesline. Only after all of that came the bluing rinse we just talked about, and finally, if the household could afford it, a stiff dose of homemade starch mixed from wheat potato scrapings or rice, worked carefully into collars and cuffs before they were hung to dry. Can you imagine organising your entire week every single week around a process with that many individual steps, none of which could simply be skipped or rushed? And even once everything was finally dry, the job was still nowhere near finished. Almost every piece of clothing then needed ironing using heavy flat irons, that Victorian households, with a rather grim sense of humour about it, nicknamed sad irons. Sad in this case meaning simply heavy, solid, dense, an old-fashioned use of the word that had nothing to do with anyone's mood at all. Though by that point in the week, the emotional meaning probably fit just as well. Several irons were kept rotating on the stove at once, one heating while another was already in use, a woman testing the temperature of each with a licked finger, or a scrap of damp cloth before ever risking it against a good shirt, because a cooling iron pressed too long against fabric did more harm than good, and a too hot one could scorch an entire afternoon's work in a single careless second. None of this came without a real physical cost, and it is worth being honest and specific about exactly what that cost looked like. Household guidance literature from the period repeatedly warned women about the dangers of straining their backs and shoulders during wash day language you do not typically expect to find casually tucked inside what was otherwise a fairly ordinary domestic handbook, sandwiched between recipes for Sunday roast and advice on polishing silver. The caustic homemade soap so many families still relied on left hands, saw cracked and visibly red, a badge of sorts that marked a woman as someone who did her own washing, rather than sending it elsewhere, a small unspoken class marker, written directly onto the skin. And the toll went further than sore hands. A study of professional laundresses working in France toward the end of the 1800s found that roughly 3 out of every 4 suffered from hernias, the direct, measurable result of repeatedly lifting waterlogged linen and heavy tubs week after week, year after year, with no real break in between. Housewives doing the exact same physical motions at home, unpaid and unstudied, almost certainly carried injuries of their own that nobody ever bothered writing down or examining or even acknowledging as work-related at all, because it was simply expected of them, and expected things rarely get counted as injuries. Here is where the story gets properly interesting to me though, because dread, it turns out, does not respect class lines quite as neatly as you might assume. Wealthy households naturally sidestepped the whole ordeal, entirely sending laundry out to be done elsewhere or simply employing a dedicated laundress to handle it, on the premises someone else's Blue Monday quietly outsourced. That part of the story is not surprising at all. What is surprising is what happened further down the income ladder. A study conducted in New York City in 1909 found that roughly 60% of working-class families surveyed, families who truly could not spare the money, were still choosing to pay for at least some portion of their laundry to be done by somebody else. 60%. People stretching every last coin toward rent and food and coal were still finding a way to buy their way out of Blue Monday, even partially, even just for a few precious items each week. A starched collar here, a good dress there, whatever mattered enough to be seen in public. Think about what that actually tells us. This was not simply a matter of taste or preference, the way choosing to eat out instead of cooking might be today. Families living close to the edge of real hardship were making a deliberate calculation, weighing a few precious coins against hours of their own exhaustion, and often enough deciding the exhaustion cost more. Doesn't that tell you something rather remarkable about exactly how miserable this particular chore had become? Out in more rural corners of the country, communities found their own inventive way around the burden entirely. In parts of the Midwest, small cheese and dairy cooperatives sometimes opened their own facilities, up to member families for shared washing, using the same large boilers and equipment built for processing milk during the rest of the week. One farm advice columnist of the era actively encouraged other women to push for exactly this kind of arrangement in their own communities, a kind of grassroots laundry cooperative born less out of convenience than sheer collective exhaustion. If nobody was going to invent a way out of wash day for you, apparently you simply organized your neighbors, pooled your resources, and built one yourselves. There is something quietly hopeful in that women looking at an impossible workload and choosing cooperation over resignation, long before anyone in power thought to offer them a better solution. By this point in the 1800s, entire published guides existed purely to walk women meticulously through the correct order of operations for wash-day publications that sold in extraordinary numbers, precisely because so many households were desperate for any system that might make the ordeal even slightly more bearable. One especially famous English household manual from 1866, written by a young woman named Isabella Beeton, became something close to a domestic Bible for an entire generation, laying out precise instructions not just for washing, but for running practically every corner of Victorian household life, down to the smallest detail, from the correct way to fold a napkin to the proper ratio of soap to water for a given quantity of linen. Beeton herself, worth noting, was barely into her 20s when she began compiling all of this, drawing together advice from cooks, laundresses and housekeepers far more experienced than she was, and turning it into something an entire nation of readers came to trust more than their own mother's instructions. That such exhaustive instruction manuals were even necessary tells you plenty on its own. This was not intuitive, casual, forgettable work. It was complicated enough and consequential enough if done poorly that women felt they needed a textbook just to get through it correctly. There is one more small human detail buried inside the records of this era that I think about often. On the days leading up to wash-day, households that observed a day of rest often let the men and boys of the family do more or less as they pleased, a small mercy, a single day of relaxed rules. Boots left where they fell, mud tracked in without much complaint, an extra hour of sleep nobody questioned. Which meant without fail that by Monday morning the house was already in a bit of disorder before a single tub of water had even been heated, leaving the woman of the house to somehow clean up Sunday's mess, while simultaneously launching straight into the heaviest workday of her entire week. Nobody sat down and decided this arrangement on purpose. It simply accumulated one relaxed Sunday at a time until it hardened into something that looked to everyone living inside it like the natural order of things. Rest for one member of a household, it turns out, has a long, quiet history of quietly becoming extra labor for somebody else. Isn't it strange when you really think about it, how a single day of the week could be built almost entirely around undoing what the day before had allowed to happen? So by the time Monday's laundry was finally hung, blued, starched and ironed into submission, an entire household had organized its meals, its patience and its physical strength around a single, unmovable ritual repeated identically the following week and the week after that, for as long as anyone could remember, a rhythm so deeply embedded that most women alive at the time could probably not have imagined a version of adulthood without it. And the ripple did not stop there, because Monday had already claimed every spare ounce of a woman's energy. The rest of the week quietly rearranged itself around the wreckage. Meals that evening were kept deliberately simple, often nothing more than Sunday's leftovers warmed through, since nobody had the strength left for anything more ambitious. The clothes themselves, still slightly damp, were sprinkled with water rolled tightly and set aside to wait their turn, because ironing them properly was its own separate task, entirely one that would consume most of the following day instead. One chore, in other words, was never really just one chore. It quietly reshaped the shape of an entire week again and again for a lifetime. And while all of this was unfolding inside ordinary Victorian homes across England and the eastern half of America, something else entirely was quietly taking shape in the growing crowded cities further west, a version of this same ancient chore that had almost nothing to do with dread guilt or household duty, and everything to do with survival. An entire community of people, pushed to the very edges of nearly every other opportunity available to them, was about to turn washing clothes into something the Victorian housewife scrubbing her own collars at home could hardly have imagined a profession, a livelihood, a hard-won foothold in a country that offered them almost nothing else, and eventually, remarkably, a fight that would reach all the way to the highest court in the land. By the 1850s, ships were arriving on the western coast of America, carrying thousands of hopeful young men from southern China, drawn by rumors of gold buried in the hills of California, and by a simple, understandable hope for a better life than the one they had left behind. Many left wives and children behind too, expecting to earn enough within a few short years to sail home again as wealthy men. Very few of them found gold. Fewer still ever made it back home the way they had once imagined. What an enormous number of them found instead, whether they had ever planned for it or not, was a washtub, a hand iron, and a life stretched thin across an ocean they had crossed with nothing more than a bundle of belongings and a great deal of hope. Here is a question worth sitting with before we go any further. Why laundry specifically out of every possible trade available in a booming, chaotic young state? The honest answer says far more about America at the time than it does about the men themselves. Mining companies refused to hire them in any real numbers. Organized groups of white laborers made absolutely certain Chinese workers were pushed out of fishing, farming and factory work through threats, boycotts and outright violence. Entire towns along the coast, passing local ordinances specifically designed to squeeze Chinese-owned businesses out of one trade after another. Laundry, though, sat almost entirely outside that fight, mostly because most American men of the era considered washing clothes beneath them women's work, unworthy of a real man's ambition. Which meant, almost by accident, that one of the only doors left standing open to an entire community of immigrants was a door most of their neighbours would never have bothered walking through themselves, a trade nobody else particularly wanted, handed by default to the very people everybody else had already decided not to want either. By 1860 in California alone, roughly 1 out of every 10 residents had been born in China, and a striking share of them, having been shut out of nearly everything else, turned to the very same tub board and iron we have already spent this entire story getting to know, transforming what much of the world still treated as an unglamorous chore into something else entirely, a livelihood, a small business, a way to plant roots in a country that made abundantly clear, in law after law, exactly how unwelcome those roots were. The daily reality behind that small shopfront sign was often lonelier than most customers walking in ever paused to consider. Because the Exclusion Act made it nearly impossible for these men to send for wives or children still waiting back in China, entire communities of laundrymen lived out decades of their lives essentially alone, working from before sunrise until well past dark 6, sometimes 7 days a week, sleeping in a small back room behind the very same counter where they took in customers' shirts each morning. Historians studying this period sometimes describe these communities as bachelor societies, men who had crossed an entire ocean chasing a family's future, only to spend the better part of their working lives separated from that family by a wall of legislation none of them had any say in writing. And the laws did not stay quiet about it for long. In 1882, the United States government passed something called the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first, and to this day the only federal law in American history to ban an entire group of people from immigrating to the country based purely on their nationality. It would remain in force for 61 years. Under its shadow and under a whole web of accompanying state and local laws, Chinese immigrants already living in America were barred from ever becoming citizens. They could not vote. They could not testify in court against a white citizen, no matter what had actually happened. They could not marry outside their own community in most states. Their children were frequently barred from attending the same schools as everyone else's children. This was the country these laundrymen were building small businesses inside of one folded shirt at a time. I want to pause on one more thing before we get to the heart of this story, because I think it deserves honesty rather than a quick pass over. As Chinese laundries spread across nearly every American town and city, a mocking little catchphrase spread right alongside them, born from something truly practical, twisted into something cruel. Chinese laundrymen serving enormous numbers of customers developed a simple, remarkably efficient system, a small paper ticket torn in half. One piece kept by the customer, the other pinned to their bundle of clothing so that hundreds of orders could stay organized without a single mix-up. It was clever, it worked beautifully, and American popular culture, rather than admiring the efficiency of it, chose instead to mock the accented English these men spoke while explaining the system to customers, flattening it into a cartoonish catchphrase that showed up on stage in advertisements, in casual conversation for decades afterward. An entire community's practical ingenuity reduced by everyone else to a punchline, which makes what happened next feel even more remarkable to me. In San Francisco, by the 1880s, roughly 320 laundries were operating across the city, and the overwhelming majority of them sat inside wooden buildings simply because wood was what most working people could actually afford to build with. In 1880, the city's Board of Supervisors passed an ordinance requiring anyone operating a laundry inside a wooden structure to first obtain special permission. The stated reason was fire safety, and on paper that reason sounded almost reasonable. Wooden buildings really could burn, and laundries really did rely on constant heat and open flame to boil water all day long. On paper is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence though, because here is what actually happened once the ordinance went into effect. Of roughly 200 Chinese-owned laundries operating in wooden buildings across the city, every single one of them, except a single solitary exception, was denied a permit to continue. Meanwhile, out of roughly 80 non-Chinese-owned laundries, operating under the exact same physical conditions, in the exact same kind of wooden buildings, all but one were approved without any trouble whatsoever. Sit with these two numbers for a second. Almost every Chinese applicant refused. Almost every non-Chinese applicant approved. The wood itself apparently was never really the problem. One of the men caught in exactly this situation was an immigrant who'd arrived in California in 1861 and had been running his laundry in the very same building for 22 uninterrupted years. His actual name, according to the historical record, was Li Yik. The laundry itself, the business painted on his shopfront sign, was called Yik Wo. When the local sheriff eventually came to arrest him, he simply took the name off the sign above the door and booked him under it, mistaking his business for his own name entirely, which means one of the most important civil rights cases in the history of the United States Supreme Court carries to this very day a small, almost tender clerical error stitched permanently into its title. His laundry had passed a full fire and health inspection just the year before. City officials themselves, noting his equipment, posed no real danger to the surrounding property. And still, when he applied to renew the very same permit, it was refused, no explanation given, none required under the ordinance as written. He could have simply closed his doors quietly, the way plenty of frightened, exhausted people in his position might reasonably have chosen to do. Instead, he kept his laundry open anyway, in open, deliberate defiance of a law he believed had never truly been about fire safety at all. He was arrested, convicted, fined $10. When he refused to pay even that small amount on principle, he was sent to jail instead. He did not fight this fight completely alone either, and I think that matters enormously to the story. A mutual aid organization within San Francisco's Chinese community, known at the time as the Chinese Six Companies, raised an enormous sum of money, roughly $20,000 in the currency of the era, worth a startling amount today, to hire one of the most respected attorneys in California, a former judge himself, to argue the case all the way up through the court system. An entire immigrant community itself legally barred from citizenship voting, and basic courtroom protections pooled its own limited resources to fight for one member's right to keep his shop open. There is something quietly extraordinary in that people denied nearly every formal tool of power, finding an informal one anyway and using it with total seriousness. Can you imagine the nerve it must have taken in that particular decade, in that particular political climate, to walk into an American courtroom as a Chinese immigrant and insist calmly and repeatedly that the Constitution applied to you too? I find myself wondering too what it must have felt like inside that small laundry during the months the case slowly climbed its way through the court system. Customers still dropping off shirts and collars every morning, the daily rhythm of soap and steam and heat, continuing exactly as it always had, while somewhere in a courtroom lawyers argued over whether the man running the counter deserved the same basic protections as everyone else standing in line. The case reached the Supreme Court of the United States in 1886, and the ruling that came back unanimous from every single justice on the bench still gets taught in law schools today. The court looked past the polite neutral wording of the San Francisco Ordinance entirely straight through to how it had actually been used in practice, and concluded plainly that a law can look completely fair sitting on paper while still being wielded as a weapon against one specific group of people. Enforced with what the justices themselves described as an unequal hand, a law like that violated the promise of equal protection written into the Constitution after the Civil War, a promise the court now confirmed explicitly applied to every person living within the country's borders, not merely to its citizens. That last detail is worth sitting with on its own. In 1886, at the height of a political climate built almost entirely around excluding Chinese immigrants from American life, the nation's highest court went out of its way to state in writing that the Constitution's protections were never meant to stop at the edge of citizenship. Li Yik walked free. The ordinance was struck down completely, and every other laundry owner caught in the exact same trap walked free alongside him. Sit with the timing of that for a moment, because I think it is one of the most quietly complicated details in this entire story. This ruling protecting Chinese immigrants specifically was handed down only 4 years after the federal government had passed a law banning Chinese immigration, outright a law that would remain fully in effect for another 5 decades after Li Yik's own victory. The same nation capable of writing one of the most sweeping pieces of racial exclusion in its entire legal history was at almost the very same moment capable of producing a Supreme Court ruling that still shapes equal protection law today. Both things were true at once, tangled together in the same decade, the same country, sometimes even the same courtroom. History rarely hands us a clean, simple version of progress, and I think it does us all a disservice whenever we pretend otherwise. Justice in this particular corner of American history did not arrive as a single door swinging wide open. It arrived instead as one narrow, hard-won crack of light forced open by an exhausted laundryman and his neighbours inside a house the law itself was still actively working to keep shut against them. None of this ended discrimination against Chinese Americans, not even close, and it would be dishonest of me to pretend otherwise just to give this part of the story a tidier bow. But the legal principle established that day never disappeared. It sat quietly in the background of American law for decades, occasionally overlooked, occasionally forgotten, before eventually becoming one of the bedrock citations judges still reach for whenever a law, no matter how innocent it looks written down on paper, is being used as a tool to crush one particular group of people while quietly sparing everyone else. A washtub, a hand iron, and 22 years of stubborn patient work turned out to be enough to change how an entire country's highest court understood the word equal. I don't think many of the customers who ever dropped off a shirt at that little laundry on a wooden street corner in San Francisco had any idea they were standing inside a piece of constitutional history in the making, or that the quiet, tired man taking their ticket at the counter had in his own way already outlasted an entire system built to make him disappear. And while Li Yik and thousands of laundrymen like him kept scrubbing, ironing, and quietly reshaping the law with nothing more than their own 2 hands, an entirely different kind of transformation was gathering speed on the other side of the country, one that had nothing to do with courts or ordinances at all, and everything to do with electricity sparks and a level of danger. Nobody standing over a simple washtub had ever really needed to worry about before. Picture for a moment just how strange electricity itself must have felt to an ordinary household in the earliest years of the 1900s. Many homes had only just been wired for the very first time, a single bare bulb hanging from a kitchen ceiling still counting as a small marvel worth showing off to visiting neighbours. An invisible force running through wires tucked inside your own walls, capable of lighting a room without a single flame, and if handled carelessly capable of killing a person just as silently as it lit that room. Most people had no real intuition yet for what electricity could or could not safely touch. No inherited folk wisdom passed down from a grandmother the way there had always been for lye or fire or boiling water. It was new, mysterious, and more than a little unsettling, even to the households eager enough to invite it in. Into this uneasy, half-trusting relationship between ordinary families and this brand new power source, inventors were about to introduce something that would spend the next several decades quietly injuring far more people than most of us ever learned about in school: the electric washing machine. The name most often credited with starting this whole chapter is an American inventor named Alva Fisher, who secured a patent in 1910 for a motor-driven drum that could reverse direction, as it turned a design detailed enough that historians still point to it as the blueprint modern washing machines would eventually grow from. His machine, built by a Chicago manufacturer, was given a rather bold, almost mythic-sounding name for a household appliance, Thor, after the Norse god of thunder himself. I have always found that a little funny, honestly, naming a machine that would soon be responsible for a truly alarming number of household accidents, after a god famous for wielding dangerous crackling power. Somebody in that marketing department had a sense of humour, whether they meant to or not. Worth pausing on, though, before we get too far into the story. Fisher's claim to being the very first is not quite as settled as the popular version of this tale likes to suggest. Patent records from the same general period show at least one other inventor filing similar designs before Fisher's own paperwork was finalised, and some engineering historians have pointed to a Ford Motor Company engineer who may have done much of the actual technical work credited to Fisher's name entirely. Even the confident, tidy sentence you will find in most modern encyclopedias that Alva Fisher invented, "The electric washing machine," turns out to rest on shakier ground than most people realise once you actually go looking through the paperwork. History, especially the history of who invented what first, turns out to be a far messier, more contested business than the tidy version usually taught in school. We will come back to that particular theme again before this story's finished tonight. What's not remotely in dispute, though, is how truly dangerous these first electric machines actually were. The motors sitting underneath these early washers were rarely built to withstand water in any serious way, which is a fairly significant design flaw for a machine whose entire purpose was to be surrounded by water for hours at a time. Splashing, dripping, ordinary everyday use could and did cause short circuits, and short circuits sitting directly beneath a metal tub a person's hands were constantly reaching into could and did deliver real electric shocks to the women operating them. Belts and pulleys often sat completely exposed on the outside of the machine too, spinning freely with no housing or guard to keep a stray sleeve, a loose apron string, or a curious child's fingers safely away from them. Can you imagine trusting your hands day after day to a brand new invention that even its own manufacturers were still quietly working out how to make safe? Picture an ordinary kitchen in some small American town sometime in the 1920s. Proud new washing machine gleaming in the corner, still smelling faintly of fresh paint and machine oil. A woman feeds a wet sheet toward the wringer, watching it disappear steadily between the rollers, the motor humming along in a low, confident rhythm that most days felt like nothing short of a miracle compared to the tub and washboard her own mother had used. And then on some ordinary Tuesday, nothing special about it at all. The fabric bunches unexpectedly, her fingers follow it in without thinking, the way reflex always outruns caution, and the machine, having no earthly way of understanding the difference between cotton and skin, simply keeps doing exactly what it was built to do. And then there was the wringer, the very same basic mechanism we already met earlier tonight, only now spinning with the relentless, unstoppable force of an electric motor behind it, instead of a person's own tiring arm. That distinction mattered enormously. A hand-cranked wringer, exhausting as it was, could always be stopped the instant something went wrong, because the only power behind it was your own arm, and your own arm knew immediately when to quit. An electric wringer had no such built-in mercy. It simply kept pulling and pulling and pulling whatever it had caught, whether that happened to be a stubborn shirt sleeve or a woman's own finger's hand, and eventually, in the worst recorded cases, her entire arm, until somebody managed to reach the release lever in time. Newspapers from the period occasionally reported exactly this kind of accident: a woman's clothing catching in an engine shaft, a hand pulled into rollers that had no idea and no way of knowing the difference between wet cotton and human skin. It is quite plainly where our modern expression about someone being put through the wringer actually comes from a phrase we still use casually today, without most people realizing it once described a very real, very physical kind of injury. There is a story tangled up inside this exact same mechanism, though one that I think deserves far more attention than it usually gets, and it takes us back a little earlier than Fisher's own electric thaw to the year 1888. A woman named Ellen Eglin, working as a housekeeper and government clerk in Washington, spent years watching other women scrub and wring laundry by hand, their fingers raw, their backs aching, and decided there had to be a better way. So she designed an improved clothes wringer clever enough in its construction that it truly could have changed her entire life. And then, having built something with real commercial potential, she made a decision that still quietly breaks my heart every time I come across it. Rather than patent the invention under her own name, she sold the rights outright to a white agent for $18, roughly a month's wages at the time, a small enough sum that it barely registers next to what the invention would go on to earn for somebody else entirely. When she was later asked why, in an interview with an early publication dedicated to women inventors, her answer was plain and devastating in equal measure. She explained in her own words that she was a black woman, and that if it became publicly known a black woman had invented the wringer, white customers simply would not buy it, that she was afraid to have her own name attached to the invention at all because of her colour. She was not being paranoid or overly cautious. She was reading her own country with painful practical accuracy, weighing what she knew about the market against what she knew about her own safety and dignity, and choosing the option that let her keep both intact, even at enormous personal cost. So she sold her invention quietly for a fraction of what it was actually worth. Watched the man who bought it go on to what one contemporary account plainly called great financial success, and return to her ordinary working life exactly as before, largely unrecognized for the rest of it. She did apparently go on to design a second invention afterward, hoping this time to see her own name finally attached to something she had built. There is no record that it ever reached the market at all. Sit with that for just a second, because I think it deserves more than a passing mention. The exact same basic mechanism now spinning inside Alva Fisher's celebrated electric thaw, the very same wringer millions of American households would come to rely on for decades, traces at least part of its lineage back to a black woman's kitchen table. Ingenuity, a woman who understood her invention's value so clearly that she built it, and understood her country's prejudice so clearly that she felt she had no real choice but to erase her own name from it. Isn't it strange and more than a little unfair how differently history chooses to remember a Norse god's name attached to a washing machine, compared to the actual woman whose engineering made a version of that same machine possible in the first place? The business itself moved fast too once the potential became obvious. Within a handful of years, competing manufacturers were racing each other into the same market. One Midwestern company that had originally built farm equipment, adding washing machines to its lineup almost as an afterthought during a slow season, only to watch that afterthought eventually become the entire foundation of its business. Another born from a small machine shop rather than a farm implement company, would spend the coming decades becoming one of the most recognizable appliance names in the country. None of these companies were competing on safety records, not really. They were competing on speed, on convenience, on how quickly and confidently they could convince a tired woman that this particular machine, unlike whatever she currently owned, truly understood her exhaustion. This is not an isolated coincidence either. Historians who study invention and patent records have found this exact pattern repeating itself again and again throughout this same period, women and especially women of colour quietly solving real practical problems inside their own homes and workplaces, only to have credit recognition and financial reward flow almost entirely toward whoever happened to hold enough social standing to safely put their own name on the paperwork. Some historians studying this era have noted a small but telling detail that several other women inventors of the period working in laundry and household technology made the exact same calculated choice Eglin did, filing patents under a husband's name, a brother's name, sometimes no name attached to a real person at all, simply because the marketplace of the time made honesty about who they were a genuine financial liability. The technology moved forward. The story of who actually built it did not always move forward alongside it, at least not fairly and not for everyone equally. Despite every one of these real, well-documented risks, though, the public appetite for these machines barely slowed at all. By 1928, roughly 800,000 electric washing machines had been sold across the United States, an extraordinary number for a technology still well within living memory of its own invention. Advertisements of the era leaned hard into words like modern effortless and liberating promising women, an escape from exactly the kind of back-breaking ritual we spent an entire earlier stretch of this story living through. Together glossy illustrations showing calm smiling women in tidy dresses, barely lifting a finger as the machine did all the work for them. Rarely, if ever, did those same advertisements mention short circuits, exposed belts, or the very real possibility of a hand caught somewhere it should never have been. Selling relief from one kind of harm has never required being especially honest about the new kind of harm quietly riding in alongside it a pattern. This story, if you have been paying attention tonight, has already shown you more than once, and there is something almost poetic in a slightly uncomfortable way about where this particular chapter of the story leaves us. An invisible force nobody fully understood, yet wired directly into the same small cramped room, where women had already been risking their hands and backs for centuries, promising liberation while quietly introducing an entirely new category of danger. Nobody standing over a simple wash tub back in Tudor England or colonial Virginia had ever needed to think about. Progress once again turning out to be considerably more complicated than the word itself usually suggests a lesson this particular chore seems determined to teach us over and over in a dozen different disguises across 5 centuries. None of this technology, dangerous or not, was given very long to settle comfortably into ordinary households, though. Because just as electric washing machines were beginning to feel like a normal expected part of everyday domestic life, no longer a novelty but simply another appliance humming away in the corner, world events on a scale nobody could have predicted were about to interrupt this story entirely, dragging wash day back towards scarcity rationing and the kind of resourceful improvisation nobody thought a modern household would ever need to relearn again. War has a peculiar way of reaching into the smallest, most ordinary corners of daily life and rewriting the rules there just as thoroughly as it rewrites the map. Somewhere between the headlines about troop movements and rationed sugar, an entire generation of households on both sides of the Atlantic discovered that even something as basic as washing a shirt clean had quietly become a matter of national importance. In Britain, the change arrived in careful, deliberate stages, each new restriction, landing on top of the last, until the ordinary rhythm of household life barely resembled what it had been just a few years earlier. Clothing itself went on ration first in the summer of 1941. Each person issued a fixed number of coupons meant to stretch across an entire year of shopping. 66 of them to start with a number that would only shrink further as the war dragged on. A single coat, a good pair of shoes, a proper winter dress could each swallow a painfully large share of that yearly allowance in one purchase, forcing families to plan their wardrobes the way a general might plan a military campaign. Fabric was needed elsewhere for uniforms, for parachutes, for the countless, unglamorous textile needs of a country fighting for its survival, and every yard spent on a civilian dress was a yard not spent on something the military desperately required. Then, in February of 1942, the rationing reached the washtub itself. Soap, the very substance this entire story has circled back to again and again, across 5 centuries was placed under strict government control, measured out by weight doled out in careful limited allotments to every household in the country. Can you imagine trying to keep an entire family's laundry properly clean while the very soap needed to do it was being handed out a few careful ounces at a time? The government's answer to this squeeze was a campaign that has since become something of a small legend in its own right, known simply as Make, Do and Mend. Official pamphlets appeared packed with instructions for patching worn elbows, turning a husband's old shirt collar inside out to hide the fraying, unpicking a dress that no longer fit and reassembling the fabric into something entirely new. A cheerful, endlessly capable illustrated character named Mrs. Sue, and so, appeared on posters and leaflets, walking women step by step through darning technique and fabric rescue, with the calm confidence of someone who had clearly never once faced a genuine crisis in her life. Sewing circles and mending classes sprang up in town halls and church basements across the country. Neighbours teaching neighbours skills some had never needed to learn before the war forced the issue. Picture one of those church basements some cold evening, a handful of chairs pulled into a loose circle, a single hard-working lamp, women bent over worn collars and thinning elbows, trading gossip and small pieces of practical wisdom in the exact same easy rhythm we watched women trade at an English riverbank centuries earlier in this story. Someone's mother had a trick for turning a collar. Someone else knew how to unpick a seam without leaving a single visible mark. Skills nobody had ever needed to learn in quite this much detail before were suddenly being passed hand to hand like currency, because in a very real sense that is exactly what they had become. There is something quietly moving to me about that particular detail. Actual classes, actual scheduled gatherings, built entirely around teaching ordinary women how to keep worn-out clothing alive a little longer. Necessity once again in this story that keeps circling back to exactly this same lesson, turning a private household burden into a shared communal skill. Not every household felt the pinch of rationing quite equally either, and this part of the story deserves honesty rather than a neatly wrapped ending. The coupon system charged the exact same number of coupons for a cheaply made garment as it did for a well-constructed one, which meant a family with money to spend could still buy sturdier clothing, built to survive years of hard wear, while a family without that same cushion was stuck, buying whatever their coupons could stretch to cover clothing that frayed and wore through far sooner, forcing yet more mending, yet more coupons spent simply trying to stay presentable. A wealthier household too often walked into the war years with wardrobes already fuller than most existing coats and dresses. Rationing rules never touched at all since the restrictions only applied to new purchases going forward. Scarcity, it turns out, rarely lands on everyone with quite the same weight, even when the rulebook insists it is treating every citizen identically. And amid all of that careful rationing, one particular wartime improvisation has always struck me as almost unbearably lovely. Parachute silk, smooth, strong, and suddenly available in small quantities whenever a serviceman's chute was retired from active use became one of the most treasured pieces of fabric a British household could get their hands on. Women transformed it into underwear, into nightclothes, and in the stories that have survived and been retold ever since, into wedding dresses, a bride walking down the aisle in fabric that had not so very long before carried a soldier safely out of the sky. Sometimes that very same soldier now waiting for her at the altar. Whole panels of silk still faintly marked with the folds and creases of their original purpose, cut and stitched by hand into something meant for the single happiest day a young couple might get during those uncertain years. I don't think I need to explain why that particular image has stuck with so many families long after the war itself ended. Retold at kitchen tables for generations, the dress itself sometimes carefully folded away and kept for decades afterward. Across the ocean, the shape of wartime scarcity looked a little different, though the underlying chemistry quite literally was exactly the same one we've been following since the very beginning of this story tonight. The United States never formally rationed clothing itself the way Britain did, but it rationed something else entirely, something that reaches all the way back to a cold stone laundry room in Tudor England, if you have been paying attention tonight. Fat. Ordinary kitchen fat, the very same ingredient that mixed with lye once produced the black soap boiled up by candlelight, centuries ago turned out to be desperately needed for an entirely different purpose. During wartime, the production of glycerin, a key ingredient in the explosives keeping an entire military supplied. The same basic chemical reaction that once made a king's collar white was now 400 years later wanted for an altogether more destructive kind of chemistry. The exact same raw material sitting at the crossroads of two completely opposite human impulses, keeping a household clean and keeping an army armed. Nobody boiling fat with wood ash in a 16th century kitchen could ever have imagined their humble little household trick would one day be rationed by an entire federal government for reasons that had nothing whatsoever to do with getting anyone's shirt clean. So the American government turned once again to the housewife. Starting in 1942, families across the country were asked to save every spare spoonful of cooking. Fat bacon grease scraped from a morning skillet, drippings poured off a Sunday roast, even the fatty skimmings left behind after boiling sausage, straining it all into a tin can kept beside the stove, then carrying that can down to the local butcher when it was full. Beginning in December of 1943, that small sacrifice actually came with the reward attached 4 cents and 2 precious red ration points for every single pound, handed in points that could then be spent on rationed meat elsewhere. Newspapers and radio broadcasts leaned hard into the campaign, urging women not to let what they called victory psychology convince them the small daily habit no longer mattered. Girl Scout troops organized neighborhood collection drives up and down the country. One troop out in Montana reportedly gathered more than 23 tons of it in just 2 months flat. An almost unbelievable number for something most families would otherwise have poured straight down the drain without a second thought. Over the full stretch of the program from 1942 through 1946, more than 711 million pounds of kitchen fat were collected across the country, close to 3/4 of it coming directly out of ordinary civilian kitchens rather than restaurants or military bases. Government advertisements leaned into language that sounds almost startling to modern ears. One widely repeated wartime slogan, warning that a single wasted spoonful of fat represented several lost bullets on the battlefield. A strange, slightly uncomfortable equation drawn directly between a woman's kitchen habits and the outcome of a war being fought thousands of miles away. Isn't it strange to think about a housewife straining bacon grease into a coffee can, quietly participating in the exact same chemistry that once made a Tudor laundress's soap now redirected entirely toward the machinery of war? The ingredients never changed. Only the purpose did, decided entirely by whoever happened to control the factories and the front lines at any given moment in history. Fat plus lie had always meant clean linen. For a few strange urgent years in the middle of the 20th century, it also meant bullets, and an entire nation's kitchens were quietly recruited into deciding which outcome mattered more. Not everyone cooperated as eagerly as the propaganda posters like to suggest, and I think that particular honesty is worth including here too. Plenty of women already stretched thin managing rationed food, rationed everything, and in many cases entirely new jobs taken on to replace husbands and sons now serving overseas, simply did not have the spare time or patience to carefully render down every last drop of cooking fat on top of everything else already demanded of them. The campaign's own internal reports acknowledged as much, noting frankly that participation lagged well behind what officials had hoped for. Patriotic duty and sheer daily exhaustion, it turns out, do not always sit comfortably together, no matter how cheerful the poster asking for your cooperation happens to look. Some households, especially in regions where saving cooking fat had already been an ordinary frugal habit, long before any government campaign told them to do it, simply kept doing what they had always done, quietly unimpressed by official instructions to value something they had never once thought to waste in the first place. Have you ever noticed how a government asking nicely for a sacrifice tends to work far better on people who are not already making that sacrifice quietly on their own for years beforehand? What strikes me most, sitting with both of these stories side by side, the British seamstress carefully unpicking an old dress, the American housewife straining fat into a tin can, is how completely the war managed to turn private domestic habits into matters of public strategy. For a few short years, something as small and personal as how a woman washed her family's clothes, or what she chose to do with a spoonful of leftover grease, was treated by entire governments as a genuine contribution to victory itself. The chore this whole story has followed across 5 centuries had never before been handed quite this much official, deliberate importance, elevated overnight from private drudgery to public duty, celebrated in posters and newsreels, the very same women scrubbing collars back in Tudor England or Victorian London could never have imagined receiving. And there is a small quiet irony sitting underneath all of it too, one I don't think gets mentioned nearly often enough. All that hard-won thrift, all that careful mending and fat saving and coupon stretching was born entirely out of necessity, not virtue. Nobody chose scarcity because they believed deeply in living with less. They adapted to it because the alternative simply was not available, which makes what happened the moment that necessity finally lifted feel almost inevitable in hindsight, a whole generation having spent years being told that thrift itself was patriotic, about to be introduced to the exact opposite message entirely. Millions of women had spent the better part of a decade first through economic depression, then through war, treating scarcity as a kind of quiet, unglamorous heroism, learning to stretch, salvage and repair nearly everything that passed through their hands. That habit does not simply switch off the moment the danger passes. It lingers in the body in the instinct to save a button, to patch, rather than replace long after the emergency that first demanded it has ended. Whatever came next for wash day would have to be convincing enough to finally talk an entire generation out of a mindset the last several years had worked so hard to build into them. Because once the war ended and factories that had spent years building tanks and parachutes suddenly needed something new to manufacture an entire generation of exhausted, rationed, thoroughly worn-out households, was about to be introduced to a version of a wash day unlike anything that had come before it. One built not around scarcity and careful mending at all, but around abundance, convenience, and the confident gleaming promise of never having to think about a washboard again. Long before peace was ever officially declared, a small idea had already been quietly planted, waiting patiently for the right moment to grow into something enormous. Back in 1934, in the middle of the Great Depression, a modest storefront opened in Fort Worth, Texas, offering something nobody in that particular corner of the country had ever tried before. 4 electric washing machines lined up in a row, available to rent by the hour. No need to own one yourself, no enormous upfront cost, just a small fee and a bit of patience while your load finished spinning, a genuine relief in a decade when very few families could afford to buy a machine of their own outright. They called it a washateria, a slightly playful blend of washing and cafeteria, the same casual self-service spirit that was already changing how Americans thought about eating out, now quietly applied to getting their clothes clean. There was still an attendant on duty the entire time, and there was still no dryer waiting at the end of the process, meaning customers carried their damp laundry straight back home to hang it themselves, exactly the way it had been done for centuries before them. It was a beginning, not yet the full picture, a single small storefront that had no idea yet what it was about to start. The full picture would have to wait more than a decade until an entire nation, freshly out of a war that had asked its households to save soap, save fat and stretch every coupon imaginable, was finally ready to be sold the exact opposite message, an unapologetic embrace of ease. In 1947, an inventor named Harry Greenwald solved the one remaining obstacle standing between that little Texas storefront and something the whole country could eventually use: a truly reliable coin-operated timer that could be attached directly to a washing machine. He partnered with Westinghouse, a company already well known for its own line of home appliances, to fit these coin meters onto machines built specifically for public unattended use. Drop in a coin and the machine simply did the rest on its own. Exactly on schedule, no attendant required to collect fees or flip a switch by hand. Within a couple of years, the first fully automated 24-hour facilities were opening their doors, unattended, unlocked, available, whenever a person's schedule happened to allow it, day or night, an idea that would have sounded almost like science fiction to anyone standing at a Tudor riverbank centuries earlier in this story. The name most of us still use for these places today, incidentally, was not born out of laundry at all, at least not directly. An employee at Westinghouse named George Edward Pendray, tasked with naming this new kind of self-service washing business, borrowed half his inspiration from the very same word that had already given Americans their beloved automated cafeterias, blending laundry and automat together into a single tidy word: laundromat. It was registered as a trademark, at first fiercely protected, which is why you will still occasionally spot an older storefront calling itself something slightly different. A washerette, a laundrette, quietly dodging somebody else's legal claim to the more familiar name. Lawyers spent years defending that trademark before eventually losing the battle entirely, the word slipping its leash the way truly successful brand names sometimes do, becoming so common in everyday speech that almost nobody today realizes it was ever anybody's private property to begin with. Can you think of another everyday word you use constantly without ever once wondering whether some company decades ago tried to keep it locked up entirely for themselves? The idea did not stay confined to American soil for very long either. By May of 1949, London had its own version, a coin-operated public laundry opening its doors in the Queensway area of the city, an instant success that quickly inspired similar shops to spread across Britain under their own local name, the Launderette. Within a handful of years, similar shops were opening across continental Europe too, each country adapting the basic idea slightly to fit its own habits and its own language. The coin-operated communal wash house, becoming in its own quiet way one of the more successful cultural exports of the entire 20th century. A single practical idea born out of Depression-era Texas thrift and perfected by post-war American convenience had crossed an entire ocean, once again joining the very same long migration of laundry technology this story's been quietly tracking since its opening minutes tonight. Picture what one of these places would have actually felt like in those first few years. Rows of humming machines lined up along a bright tiled room, the low rhythmic thump of a dozen loads turning at once, the smell of warm detergent and fabric softener, drifting out into the street each time the door swung open. Benches along the wall filled up with neighbours who had until quite recently never had much occasion to sit shoulder to shoulder with each other for an entire afternoon. Magazines passed hand to hand, children fidgeting on the floor between loads, somebody's radio playing quietly in the corner. Some locations added little extras almost immediately, a bench here, a radio there, eventually even small snack counters in the busier city locations, turning what could have been a purely functional errand into something closer to a genuine social occasion. There is a small echo, if you think about it, of an English riverbank centuries earlier in this story. Women gathered together over a shared, unavoidable chore gossip and laughter, filling in the gaps between the actual scrubbing. Only now the river had been replaced by a coin slot, and the open sky by a ceiling of humming fluorescent light. While all of this machinery was multiplying, something just as significant was happening inside the washwater itself, a change so fundamental that it would end up mattering just as much as any coin slot or automated timer. For generations, soap, whatever form it happened to take, carried one stubborn, aggravating flaw. In areas with hard water, and a great deal of the country had exactly that soap reacted with the minerals dissolved in the water to form a filmy greyish residue, a curd clinging stubbornly to fabric no amount of extra rinsing seemed able to fully remove. Whites dulled. Colours faded a little more with every single wash. Entire generations of women had simply accepted this as an unavoidable fact of laundry, the same way they had once accepted that clean linen only came once a year, or that a caustic bar of homemade soap would always leave your hands a little raw. It was in a sense the exact same yellowing problem Victorian housewives had once tried to trick the human eye around, with a careful rinse of blue dye still quietly unsolved a full century later, just wearing a slightly different disguise. Chemists at Procter & Gamble have been chasing a real solution to this problem since the early 1930s, an internal project that for a long stretch of years simply refused to work. The company had already tasted a small success a decade earlier, with an earlier synthetic cleaner gentle enough for baby clothes and effective in hard water. But it simply could not handle heavily soiled laundry, the kind of grease and grime an ordinary family produced every single week. Researchers tried adding stronger boosting compounds to increase its cleaning power, only to discover that those same compounds left fabric feeling stiff and scratchy, sandpaper rough against the skin. By the end of that decade, the company had officially given up and shut the whole effort down. The project quietly filed away as a dead end. One particular chemist, a patient stubborn researcher named Dick Byerly, kept quietly experimenting on his own time anyway, unwilling to let a promising idea die just because the official paperwork said it should. For more than a decade on and off he kept chasing the missing piece, and in 1941 he finally found it, discovering almost by accident that instead of using less of a certain cleaning compound, the way everyone had always assumed was correct, using considerably more of it produced a detergent that cleaned beautifully and still left fabric soft to the touch. A single stubborn man tinkering quietly on a project his own employer had already declared finished had just solved a problem 5 centuries of soap makers, from a Tudor laundress boiling mutton fat to a Victorian housewife carefully rinsing in blue dye, had never fully managed to crack. That quiet, stubborn persistence eventually became a product launched to the public in 1946, sold under a single short punchy name, Tide, still sitting in laundry rooms across the country today. It sold out almost the moment it hit store shelves, advertised as nothing less than a wash day miracle. Entire test markets emptied of stock within weeks. Within just a few years, it had captured close to a third of the entire American laundry market, effectively ending the reign soap itself had held over this exact same chore for every single one of the 500 years we've spent walking through together tonight. Rival companies scrambled to catch up, almost overnight chemists at competing brands, suddenly racing to reverse engineer the same basic breakthrough, a smaller, quieter echo of the very same competitive fever that once drove a whole generation of inventors to chase the first working washing machine. Think back just for a moment to those 4 modest rented machines sitting in a single Texas storefront back in 1934. Within barely 2 decades, that same basic idea had multiplied into thousands of locations across an entire country and then across an entire ocean, while the very chemistry inside the wash water itself had been completely reinvented from the ground up. Rarely in this 500-year story has the pace of change moved quite this quickly. Decades of near-total stillness suddenly compressed into less than a single generation. Isn't it a little remarkable that after 5 centuries of wood ash, animal fat and painstakingly boiled lye, the ingredient finally powerful enough to dethrone soap itself came from a chemist who refused to stop tinkering on a project his own employer had already declared dead? All of this, the machines, the coin slots, the chemistry, arrived at almost precisely the same moment. An entire generation of young families was moving into brand new houses on the edges of growing American cities. Entire neighborhoods rose out of former farmland, seemingly overnight, row after row of nearly identical houses built quickly and affordably for returning veterans and their new families. Many of them financed through government loan programs specifically designed to make home ownership possible for people who had never dreamed of owning property before. And tucked into the floor plan of these new homes, often for the very first time in the history of ordinary domestic architecture, sat a small, dedicated room specifically designed to hold a washing machine of their very own, something that would have sounded like pure fantasy to nearly every single person we have met so far in this story. Advertisements of the era leaned hard into words like modern, effortless, and free, promising the woman of the house an entirely new kind of life, one where wash day no longer had to consume an entire day at all. Flip through a magazine from this period and you will find her everywhere. The same carefully composed image repeated again and again across dozens of different advertisements. A smiling young woman in a crisp dress and a string of pearls, barely glancing at the washing machine, doing all the work beside her, more interested in the camera than the chore itself. Radio jingles and before long brand new television commercials reinforced the exact same message, a machine humming quietly in the background, while a confident voice promised freedom, leisure, more time for the family, more time for herself. It was without question an enormous improvement over a washboard and a boiling copper. Whether it delivered quite as much actual free time as those advertisements liked to promise is a rather different question entirely, and one this story is not quite finished asking yet. We're going to come back to that particular promise very soon because it deserves a much closer, more honest look than the advertisements of the era were ever willing to give it themselves. A woman standing in her own new utility room, brand new machine humming quietly in the corner box of Tide sitting on the shelf beside it, had every reason in the world to believe the hardest chapter of this entire 500-year story was finally completely behind her. For now, though, sit with this. Barely a decade removed from ration books, salvaged fat, and coupons stretched to their absolute breaking point, an entire generation of households suddenly found themselves standing in front of gleaming new machines, boxes of miracle detergent in hand, being told quite confidently by every magazine advertisement and radio jingle available to them that the oldest, heaviest chore in this entire story had finally truly been solved once and for all. Whether that confident promise actually held up under closer examination is a question well worth asking, and it turns out the answer is far more complicated than any of those cheerful advertisements ever let on. Every so often, a single researcher asks one deceptively simple question, and an entire comfortable assumption quietly falls apart underneath it. In 1983, a historian named Ruth Schwartz Cowan published a book that did exactly that, to one of the tidiest, most widely believed stories in modern domestic life. The idea that washing machines, detergent, and every other gleaming household appliance we just spent the last stretch of this story celebrating had finally handed women their freedom back. Cowan was not interested in nostalgia, and she was certainly not interested in arguing that the washboard and the buck tub had secretly been better. She simply wanted to know, as a historian trained to trust evidence over assumption, whether the story everyone told about these machines actually matched what the historical record showed. So she went looking for actual evidence to back up that assumption. What she found instead was one of the strangest, most quietly unsettling contradictions in the entire history of housework. Time-use researchers going back through decades of careful diary studies, where ordinary women recorded hour by hour exactly how they spent their day, found something almost nobody expected. A survey from 1965 showed the average American woman spending roughly 55 hours a week on housework and childcare. 55 hours more than a full-time job every single week, without pay, without a weekend, without a performance review or a promotion waiting at the end of it. Now here is the part that stops people cold every single time I explain it. That number was almost identical to how much time her own grandmother had spent on the very same categories of work back in 1912, decades before a single electric washing machine had ever entered an ordinary home. Sit with that for a moment, because I don't think it gets nearly the attention it deserves. Every single piece of machinery we have followed across this story tonight, the drum washers, the electric motors, the coin-operated laundromats, the miracle detergent that finally beat soap after 500 years, and the actual number of hours an ordinary woman spent working inside her own home barely budged at all. Picture her for a moment, a young mother somewhere in the 1960s standing in that brand new utility room we described a little earlier, machine humming exactly the way the advertisements had promised. On paper, her life should have looked almost unrecognisably easier than her grandmother's, and in some very real ways her hands were not raw, her back did not ache the way a Victorian laundresses once had. But her calendar somehow still filled up completely, laundry now folded into an ever-expanding list of daily tasks nobody 100 years earlier would have thought to demand of a single person, all while glossy magazines on the very same coffee table quietly told her she should be grateful and perhaps a little guilty for not managing it all with more visible cheer. How does that happen? How do you hand somebody a truly powerful, truly time-saving piece of technology and somehow still end up with the exact same workload sitting on her shoulders decades later? Cowan's answer laid out across the book that would eventually become required reading in university history departments everywhere, and win a major prize from the very society dedicated to studying the history of technology comes down to a handful of quiet, easily overlooked shifts, none of them nearly as dramatic as a new machine rolling off a factory line, but each of them added together powerful enough to completely cancel out the time technology should have saved. The first shift is the one we've actually been tracking all along tonight without quite naming it yet, a steadily rising standard of what clean even means. Remember the household we met earlier washing clothes only once a year, an entire village organising itself around a single great wash. Remember too the Victorian household we visited later, already stretched thin by a weekly ritual that felt at the time almost unbearably frequent. By the time washing machines and modern detergent had fully settled into ordinary homes, that same household was expected to wash clothing not once a year, not even once a week, but essentially continuously. A fresh shirt. Daily sheets changed far more often than any previous generation would have thought remotely necessary. Children's clothing laundered after a single afternoon of play, rather than worn again the next day without a second thought. Each individual load, thanks to the machine, took less physical effort than ever before, but there were now so many more loads that the total hours spent simply refused to shrink. You can hand someone a faster tool and still bury them in work if you also quietly triple how often that tool needs using. This second shift is a little more uncomfortable to sit with, and I think it deserves real honesty rather than a passing mention. As washing machines spread through middle-class homes, something else was quietly disappearing at almost exactly the same pace paid help. The commercial laundresses, the hired household servants, the neighbourhood laundry services that wealthier and even moderately comfortable families had relied on for generations. Remember, this entire story has already introduced you to plenty of them. All of that infrastructure of shared distributed labour began vanishing, partly because other jobs had finally opened up for the working class, women who once filled those roles, and partly because owning your own machine made outside help feel, at least on paper, entirely unnecessary, which meant a task that used to be spread across multiple sets of hands, a hired laundress, an older daughter, sometimes even a husband hauling water or turning a mangle, increasingly narrowed down to exactly one person working entirely alone, machine humming beside her, no sister at the next tub, no neighbour sharing the same bleaching green. Just one woman and one machine expected to handle what an entire household or an entire village once handled together. Can you see the shape of that trap starting to form faster tools but far more frequent use, performed now by one isolated person instead of several? There's a third piece to this too quieter still, and in some ways the most powerful of all. An entire new cultural ideal took hold across exactly this period, the idea of homemaking as something close to a genuine profession, requiring dedication, expertise, and a kind of quiet, unpaid perfectionism nobody had ever formally demanded before. Magazines, advice columns, and home economics courses taught an entire generation of women that a truly good mother did not simply get clothing clean, she did it with pride, with method, with an almost scientific attention to detail, folding, organising, and maintaining an entire household as though it were itself a small exacting business. She alone was responsible for running well. Entire courses were built around teaching young women the supposedly correct, efficient way to fold a towel or sort a hamper, treating what had once been simple, ordinary competence as something closer to a formal credential. Advertisements leaned hard into a mother's sense of guilt and duty, gently suggesting that a child sent to school in a slightly less than pristine shirt reflected somehow on her, not on the machine, not on the detergent, on her character, her attentiveness, her worth as a parent. The technology had changed. The pressure to prove your own worth through the results of that technology had, if anything, gotten heavier, quietly transferring the emotional weight of an entire household's appearance onto one person's shoulders and calling it modern convenience. And this was never a purely American story, either worth mentioning for anyone watching from across the Atlantic tonight. British and European researchers studying their own households through this same stretch of the 20th century kept stumbling onto strikingly similar numbers. The same stubborn refusal of total housework hours to fall anywhere near as fast as the machinery filling up their kitchens and laundry rooms. Different countries, different appliances, different advertising campaigns entirely, and yet again and again the same quiet pattern showing up in the data. I want to be fair here and mention that not every historian agrees completely with Cowan's numbers, and I think a good storyteller owes you that complication, rather than hiding it for the sake of a tidier ending. Some economists looking at the very same decades through a different lens, using different diary studies and different assumptions about what counts as housework in the first place, have argued the picture is not quite this bleak, estimating that weekly household chores actually fell substantially over the 20th century, from somewhere near 70 hours a week in 1900, down closer to 30 by 1970. Measuring something as messy personal and inconsistently recorded as housework, spread across millions of different households with wildly different circumstances, incomes, family sizes, and regional habits, was never going to produce one single, universally agreed number that satisfies every historian equally. But even the more optimistic estimates still land on the same underlying point Cowan was making. The drop in hours never came anywhere close to matching the sheer scale of the mechanical revolution these households had just lived through. A 70% improvement in the tools themselves simply did not translate into anything close to a 70% improvement in free time. Here is a question worth turning over in your own mind for a second. If you personally could suddenly do every household task in half the time, would you actually end up with twice the free time, or would you simply find yourself doing twice as much, folding it quietly into whatever gap the time savings had just opened up without ever really noticing the trade taking place? I think this is the real quiet lesson sitting underneath everything we have walked through together tonight, from a candlelit palace corridor all the way to a humming suburban laundry room. Every single era we have visited handed this particular chore to someone, and it was almost never randomly decided. It fell along the exact same lines, again and again, gender, class, race, legal status, shifting in shape from century to century, sometimes shared in a community, sometimes forced onto a single enslaved woman with no say in the matter at all, sometimes quietly erased from the patent records of a woman clever enough to invent her own way out of it, but never quite disappearing entirely. New tools arrived, new chemistry arrived. Entire industries rose and fell chasing this one stubborn, ordinary task. And through every single one of those transformations, the actual weight of it, the hours, the attention, the quiet expectation that somebody specifically would handle it without complaint kept landing with startling consistency on the same set of shoulders. I don't say any of that to leave you feeling hopeless about it, because the story truly does keep moving, and not always in a discouraging direction. More recent research, looking at decades further along than the numbers Cowan originally studied, actually does show real measurable declines in total housework time, particularly as households have continued changing shape, as expectations have slowly shifted, and as the division of labour inside a home has, at least in some places, started looking a little more balanced than it once did, husbands and partners sharing chores in ways that would have seemed almost unthinkable to the men we met kicking their boots off in a relaxed Sunday parlour generations earlier in this story. Progress on this particular front has been slower and far less tidy than any washing machine advertisement ever promised. But it has not been standing completely still either, which brings us in a strange roundabout way right back to the present moment, to your own home, your own laundry basket sitting exactly where we left it, hanging in your imagination earlier tonight. Because the machines today are smarter than anything Alva Fisher or Hamilton Smith could have dreamed of, quieter, safer, astonishingly efficient, controlled from a phone screen instead of a hand crank. And yet if you looked closely enough at the world, this chore now touches water usage, energy consumption, and a whole category of harm nobody in this story has even mentioned, yet tiny, and I do mean tiny. You might discover that 500 years after a Tudor laundress first boiled fat and ash together by candlelight, this endlessly patient, endlessly adaptable chore has found an entirely new way to complicate our lives. One so small it can only be seen under a microscope, and yet already large enough to be turning up in rivers, oceans, and eventually quietly in us. Here is where this story finally catches up to tonight, to whatever machine happens to be humming somewhere in your own house. Right now, folding laundry into the same quiet, unremarkable rhythm it has followed for as long as you can remember, and to a kind of harm nobody scrubbing linen by a river or boiling lye in a palace kitchen could have possibly imagined. Every time a load of synthetic clothing goes through a modern washing machine, polyester, nylon, acrylic, anything woven from essentially the same family of material as plastic itself, that fabric quietly sheds. Not visibly, not in any way you would ever notice standing in your own kitchen. Researchers first measured this carefully back in 2016, running ordinary laundry loads through ordinary domestic machines, and then filtering every single drop of the wastewater that came out the other end, counting individual fibers under a microscope one by one. Their findings, since repeated and confirmed by labs across several different countries, was that a single 6-kilogram load, roughly what one person might wash in an average week, can release more than 700,000 individual microscopic fibers into the water. Some more recent studies using even finer filters, capable of catching particles too small for the original research to detect, have pushed that estimate dramatically higher into the millions per load. Nobody watching their shirt spin behind a little round window has any way of knowing this is happening at all. Those fibers are simply too small for most wastewater treatment systems to fully catch. They pass straight through, out into rivers, out into the ocean, where they have been found drifting in currents thousands of miles from the nearest washing machine, settling into sediment on the seafloor far deeper than any diver could easily reach, and turning up increasingly inside the very fish and shellfish that eventually end up back on somebody's dinner plate. Scientists have documented these same fibers riding air currents too, drifting for miles beyond where they were ever released, settling quietly onto snow in places about as far from a laundry room as anywhere on the planet, remote mountain peaks and polar ice that no washing machine has ever come within 1,000 miles of. Researchers are still working out exactly what that means for human health over a lifetime of exposure, but the fibers themselves have already been found inside human blood, lungs, and other tissue in early studies, a discovery that would have sounded like pure science fiction to literally every single person we have met so far in this story tonight. Can you picture Anne Harris standing over her buck tub by candlelight, ever imagining that 5 centuries later, the simple act of getting a shirt clean could scatter invisible plastic fragments into an ocean she would never even know existed, an ocean whose very name she may never once have heard spoken in her entire lifetime? The clothing itself, meanwhile, has changed just as dramatically as the water it gets washed in, and not necessarily for the better. Remember the household we followed earlier in this story? delighted that industrial spinning and weaving finally let ordinary families own more than 1 or 2 shirts each, and remember too the quiet warning tucked inside that same chapter, that cheaper clothing would eventually mean more laundry, not less work overall. That trend never actually slowed down. It simply kept accelerating decade after decade until it arrived at something today's fashion industry openly calls fast fashion, entire new clothing lines designed, manufactured, shipped, and sitting on store shelves within a matter of weeks rather than the traditional seasonal cycle earlier generations of designers once worked within. What began as an 18th century inventor's dream of finally making enough cloth for everyone has 2.5 centuries later curdled into something closer to disposable culture clothing built to be worn a handful of times before it is quietly replaced, an entire garment sometimes costing less than the coffee somebody drank while buying it, a price tag that only makes sense once you realize the true cost was simply moved somewhere else entirely onto a river, a cotton field, a distant factory worker, nobody buying the jeans will ever meet. That speed comes at a cost most shoppers never see reflected on the price tag. Producing a single pair of ordinary cotton jeans from the cotton field, all the way through dyeing and finishing, requires somewhere between roughly 3,000 and 10,000 litres of water, depending on exactly how the calculation is done and where the cotton happened to be grown, estimates varying widely enough between different researchers that I think it is only fair to give you the honest range rather than pretend there is one single tidy number. Even taking the more conservative end of that range, that is thousands of litres of water, enough to fill dozens of bathtubs folded invisibly into a $20 pair of jeans picked off a rack without a second thought. Isn't it strange when you think about it that a Tudor laundress spent an entire day accounting for every single ounce of water she boiled, while today thousands of litres can disappear into a single garment before it has even been worn once without a single person along the way stopping to count them? Anne Harris knew precisely where every drop of her chamber lye came from, and precisely what it cost her in effort to produce it. Most of us today could not tell you even roughly how much water went into the shirt we happen to be wearing right this moment. We traded one kind of intimate, painful knowledge for a kind of comfortable, convenient distance, and it is worth asking every now and then what exactly that trade actually cost us. There is at least a small measure of hope stitched into this particular thread of the story too. Once the science became impossible to ignore, engineers and even a handful of ordinary households started fighting back in truly practical ways, specially designed mesh bags that trap fibres before they ever reach the drain external filters fitted onto the machine itself. Some countries even beginning to discuss laws that would require this kind of filtration as standard equipment on every new washing machine sold. None of it undoes the fibres already sitting somewhere at the bottom of the ocean, but it is at the very least proof that once this particular harm finally became visible enough to measure, people did not simply shrug and accept it as the unavoidable cost of clean clothes. And once these clothes actually make it into a household, an old familiar shape from earlier tonight quietly resurfaces too. The exact same divide we watched play out in New York City tenements over a century ago, only wearing modern clothing of its own. Back then, remember, roughly 60% of working-class families surveyed were still finding a way to pay for at least some of their laundry, even while stretching every coin toward rent and food. Today's version of that same struggle looks a little different, but the underlying shape is almost eerily familiar. Recent surveys of the low-income households across America have found that a striking percentage, nearly 3 out of every 4 in one widely cited study, admit to skipping laundry altogether some weeks simply to save money, while roughly a third report bathing without soap when they cannot afford to replace it. This is happening right now, in the same country whose washing machines and detergent brands we just spent an entire stretch of this story celebrating as the final word in convenience in homes, standing not far at all from a laundromat we might have described as a cheerful community gathering place only a few chapters ago tonight. There is a particular consequence to this that rarely makes it into conversations about laundry at all. Teachers in some of the hardest hit school districts began noticing a pattern few people had ever thought to track carefully children missing school or simply refusing to go specifically on days when their only clean clothes had run out. Embarrassed in a way that had nothing to do with grades or behaviour at all, sometimes teased by classmates for wearing the same shirt twice in a single week, sometimes simply too self-conscious to sit through an entire school day in it. Some teachers quietly, without any program telling them to, started taking bags of students' dirty laundry home themselves, washing it in their own machines on their own time, buying detergent out of their own paychecks, never mentioning it to anyone. One major appliance manufacturer eventually heard enough of these stories directly from teachers to take real notice. And rather than simply writing a check, the company began donating actual washing machines and dryers to schools, instead installed quietly in laundry rooms tucked beside the nurse's office, available to any student or family who needed them. No explanation, required no paperwork to fill out in front of a line of other parents. Schools running these programs have reported real measurable improvements in attendance among the students using them, some notably so. A reminder, I think that sometimes the most meaningful fix for an old stubborn problem is not a brand new invention at all, no clever chemistry, no patent, no coin. Operated timer, just an existing machine placed directly into the hands of somebody who actually needed it, without a single ounce of shame attached to the offer. Have you ever thought about how something as small as a clean shirt can quietly decide whether a child feels safe enough to walk through a school door at all? I find something oddly familiar in all of this. Honestly, a comforting kind of familiarity, if that makes any sense. Because this exact same pattern, hardship concentrated among the people with the least power to escape it, followed almost immediately by some quiet act of collective ingenuity, trying to close the gap, has been the actual through line of this entire 500-year story, far more than any single machine or invention ever was. Village women pooling a single buck tub because none of them could afford their own. An entire immigrant community raising money together to fight a rigged permit system in court. A teacher on her own time folding a stranger's child's clothes so that child could simply walk into class without shame. The tools keep changing completely unrecognizably. Generation after generation wood ash giving way to synthetic detergent, a riverbank giving way to a phone-controlled machine. The instinct sitting underneath them, apparently, does not change nearly as much. So here we are, 5 centuries after a single candlelit palace corridor standing at the edge of an ocean, quietly filling with fibres too small to see in a country where washing machines sit in the vast majority of homes, and yet millions of families still cannot always afford to use one. Progress, real, undeniable progress, sitting right alongside problems that would have been completely unrecognizable to every single person this story has introduced you to tonight, and yet somehow underneath all of it still asking exactly the same question it always has. Whose job is this really? And who in the end actually pays the price for it, whether that price gets paid in aching hands, in stolen credit, in a missed school day, or in something so small it can only be measured under a microscope drifting quietly through water, none of us can see the bottom of. We are almost at the end of this journey now, 500 years compressed into a single night, and there is one last thing worth doing before we close the door on it, completely, stepping all the way back far enough to finally see the whole shape of it, laid out at once, every hand, every hardship, every small stubborn act of resilience we have walked through together, from a cold stone corridor in Tudor England to a laundry room quietly tucked inside a modern elementary school. Close your eyes for a moment if you haven't already, and picture her one more time. Anne Harris alone in that cold stone corridor candle, throwing shadows twice her size against the wall, a bucket of chamber lye resting quietly at her feet, her breath still faintly visible in the cold night air of a palace that has long since fallen silent around her. She has no idea, of course, standing there in the 1500s, that she's standing at the very beginning of anything at all. To her it is simply Tuesday, simply another night of work before another morning of more work, another basin to fill another set of raw knuckles, to nurse quietly the next morning before anyone else in the household is even awake. She will never know her name would still be spoken centuries later by strangers gathered around a screen that would have looked to her like pure sorcery in countries she never once heard named in her entire lifetime. That is the strange, quiet gift history occasionally hands us if we are patient enough to go looking for it. The chance to stand somewhere she never could, high enough above her own single night, to finally see the whole shape of what came after it, the way a single dropped stone can only ever feel its own small splash. Never the rings it sends rippling outward long after it has already sunk. So let's stand there together just for these last few minutes before we let her go. From that one candlelit corridor, this story fanned out in every direction. Imaginable, like water finally allowed to spread across open ground. It travelled into English villages where washing became a once-a-year festival, entire communities gathering at a riverbank to beat a season's worth of linen clean, trading gossip and laughter in the one stretch of time nobody could tell them how to spend wooden beetles, thudding against wet cloth in a rhythm that must have carried for miles across otherwise quiet fields. It crossed an ocean and darkened considerably, settling into a small brick building behind a grand house on the Potomac, where women who owned nothing, not their labour, not their time, not even their own children under the law of the land, kept an entire household looking flawless. 6 days out of every 7 ironing fine linen with hands that never once had enough spare cloth of their own to wear. It found its way into the hands of immigrants who had been shut out of nearly every other trade available to the men who built livelihoods out of the one door still standing open, and who, when that door was slammed on them too, walked into an American courtroom and quietly rewrote what equal protection was allowed to mean an entire community, pooling what little money they had to make sure one man's shop stayed open. It sparked and short-circuited its way through the earliest electric machines, injuring the very women it promised to save, while somewhere behind the scenes, a woman clever enough to invent a better ringer sold her own name out of the story entirely, simply to survive a world that would have punished her for keeping it. It shrank down to almost nothing during a war that asked ordinary households to save soap, save fat, save every last spoonful of anything that might possibly matter to the fight, and then it exploded outward again the moment the war ended into coin-operated laundromats, and a box of detergent that finally, after 500 years, managed to dethrone soap itself. And through every single one of those transformations, we kept bumping into the exact same quiet, unresolved question, didn't we? Cowan's careful research showing us that a woman in the 1960s still worked just as many hours as her grandmother had machines or no machines. The Great Wash once a year versus Blue Monday once a week versus the near-daily rhythm of a modern household, each shift in frequency quietly cancelling out whatever the newest tool had just promised to save. And now tonight we have watched that same question follow us all the way into the present, into rivers filling with fibres too small to see into households not far from here, quietly going without into a teacher who simply started doing a stranger's laundry because nobody else was going to. Here is what I keep coming back to, turning it over in my mind long after I finished researching all of this. This was never really a story about washing machines at all, was it? Machines are just the part that photographs well, the part that ends up in museums behind a little glass case with a neat, tidy label underneath it, a patent number, a date, a manufacturer's name proudly stamped somewhere on the side. The real story, the one running underneath every single chapter we walk through together tonight, was always about who gets asked to carry the weight of something, and who gets thanked for it, and how rarely across 5 entire centuries those two lists of people ever actually matched. I don't think that is a depressing thought, strangely enough, even though it might sound like one at first. I think it is closer to an invitation. Because every single person we met tonight, and alone by candlelight, an entire village bent over a shared riverbank, Lee Yick refusing to close his shop, Ellen Eglin choosing survival over recognition, a housewife straining bacon grease into a tin can for reasons far bigger than herself, a teacher quietly folding a stranger's laundry without being asked. Every one of them found some small way to push back against the shape they had been handed. Not always successfully, not always fairly rewarded for it, and some of them, we should be honest, were never rewarded at all. But they pushed anyway, quietly, stubbornly, the exact same way people always seem to whenever the task in front of them turns out to be heavier than it ever should have been. Maybe that is the small, quiet invitation this story leaves each of us with. Tonight, an invitation to notice the Anns still standing quietly in our own lives. Right now, the person who handles the unglamorous, unphotographed work that keeps a home, a school, or a workplace running smoothly, so smoothly that everyone else simply assumes it happens on its own. It rarely does. It never really has. Somebody somewhere is always doing the noticing, doing the carrying, and perhaps the smallest, easiest gift any of us can offer after a story like this one is simply to notice them back just once out loud. Which, if you think about it, might be the real reason this particular chore has made such a surprisingly good vehicle for telling 500 years of human history through. It touches everyone eventually. King and commoner, free woman and enslaved woman, immigrant and native-born citizen, wealthy household and one struggling to keep the lights on. Nobody across this entire story has ever fully escaped needing clean clothes, which means nobody has ever fully escaped this story, either whether history chose to remember their name or not, whether a single line in a ledger somewhere managed to survive the centuries or simply vanished unrecorded, the way most ordinary lives eventually do. That more than any single invention we discuss tonight might be the truest thing this whole journey has to teach us, that history is never really made only by the people whose names get carved into stone. Far more of it quietly, patiently, gets made by hands nobody ever thought to write down at all. Before we let this particular night close all the way, I want to leave you with one small hopeful thread pulling us forward. Engineers today are quietly working on machines that use a fraction of the water and energy their grandparents' washers once demanded. Fabric researchers experimenting with materials designed specifically not to shed those tiny plastic fibers in the first place. Entire design teams rethinking clothing itself to last decades rather than months. Some even looking backward, oddly enough. Borrowing ideas from the exact kind of durable, repairable garments a wartime household once had no choice but to rely on. None of it undoes 5 centuries of hardship in a single afternoon. But it does mean the story is not finished, not by a long way, and whatever comes next, some new invention, some fresh contradiction between promise and reality, somebody somewhere is already quietly working on it right now, the same way somebody always has, all the way back to a woman boiling ash and fat together by candlelight, simply trying to make one small corner of the world a little more bearable. So here is where I'll leave you tonight, back in your own home, wherever exactly you happen to be curled up listening to this. Somewhere near you, there is probably still a laundry basket sitting quietly in its usual corner, exactly as ordinary as it always was this morning, a few stray socks, perhaps a shirt, waiting its turn, nothing about it looking any different than it did before you pressed play tonight. I did promise you, all the way back at the beginning of this journey, that you would never look at it quite the same way again, and I meant every word of it. The next time you happen to pass it, folding something warm out of the dryer, or tossing something tired into the hamper, I hope some small part of you thinks just for a second about Anne, about a riverbank full of laughing women, about a laundryman who refused to back down, about a woman who sold her own invention, rather than risk her own name, about all the quiet, uncredited hands this ordinary object has passed through across 500 years to end up sitting exactly where it is right now, waiting patiently for you and only you to notice it again. Thank you sincerely for spending this time with me tonight, for letting this particular story out of everything else you could possibly be doing right now be the last thing your mind carries with it before sleep finally takes over. Stories like this one only really work because someone on the other side is willing to slow down long enough to listen, patient enough to follow a single humble chore across 500 years without once needing it to turn into something flashier along the way, and I don't take that kind of patience for granted, not even a little. If tonight's journey gave you even a few minutes of that soft drifting kind of peace we were reaching for together, I would love for you to carry that feeling with you into whatever comes next tonight and beyond. And if you found yourself curious about where a story like this one might go next, I hope you will come back and find out with me, because there is always another quiet corner of history waiting to be uncovered, another ordinary object hiding an entire world inside it, another candle somewhere still waiting for someone to notice it burning. And if you happen to still be awake down there in the comments half drifting off already, I would still love to hear which part of tonight's story ended up staying with you the longest. Anne and her candle, the riverbank, the courtroom, or maybe just your own laundry basket looking a little different to you now than it did a few hours ago. No pressure at all, only if you feel like it, only if sleep hasn't already caught up with you first. Rest well tonight. Let your thoughts go soft and slow now, the way a candle finally settles once the flame has burned all the way down, the way an entire palace once did centuries ago, around one tired woman still quietly working, long after everyone else had already fallen asleep. Wherever you are, whatever tomorrow happens to hold for you, I am glad more than you know that you spent tonight right here with me, letting one small unglamorous chore carry you gently all the way from a Tudor palace to your own quiet room tonight. Good night.